Chapter 560. The candlelight flickered in the darkness. This was an almost spacious hall. The dim light of the candlelight flickered slightly. Where the light converged, a brand new statue of God stood there, bathed in the subtle light, looking at the surrounding darkness with a face full of pity. An old man in a white robe knelt in front of the statue and prayed devoutly. The darkness was deep, the candlelight was weak, and the prayers were silent. The whole hall seemed to have been completely frozen. The windows in the hall were open. The clear but extremely strange sound of waves came over, with the sound of countless pieces of ice colliding with each other. The ice wind in the depths of the Arctic Ocean whistled into the hall. The candlelight began to tremble, and the light and shadows in the hall were constantly turbulent. The whole hall seemed to be filled with an uneasy aura. The statue of God was still compassionate. The old man was still silent. Mellad looked at the old man in front of the statue. His expression was calm, but his heart was beating faster and faster. Another gust of cold wind whistled past, piercingly cold like a knife. The curtains in the hall were blown up. In the shrill sound of the wind, the candlelight in the hall began to spread. The faint flames seemed to be burning out of thin air. Bits of light were scattered in every corner of the hall, extremely soft. The old man opened his eyes, and his voice was strangely soft and low. The eyes of God are watching here, and the light is about to come. He raised his hand slightly. The candlelight in the whole hall burned more and more vigorously. The dim yellow light brought by countless remaining candles gradually turned white, so pure that it was almost dazzling. But these are all fake. Mellad looked at the old man in front of him, and said calmly, "What God created is naturally true." The old man said with a smile. Mellad's body tensed up, as if he was facing a formidable enemy. In the entire Vatican, only one person was qualified to wear a white robe, and only one person was qualified to wear a white dress. The latter was the Holy Virgin, and the former was the Pope. Only the Pope. No one could have imagined that after they had no choice but to withdraw from Recchi City, the Vatican, which was already badly battered, did not take advantage of the situation to withdraw from Eastern Europe. Instead, the Pope came in person. Obviously, the Pope was not willing to give up the interests of Eastern Europe. "Who the hell are you?" The Pope walked casually in the vast hall, and his tone was also careless. "Mellad, I need an explanation for all this. If there are no accidents after Eastern Europe, you will have many choices, such as continuing to stay in the Holy Disarmament Corps. I will give you more autonomy. I even want you to go to the Knights Templar to be the new Grand Knight Commander, or stay in Eastern Europe and be the spokesman of the Vatican in Eastern Europe." The Pope's tone was indifferent. "I've thought of many possibilities, and they're all about you. I dared to use you, but I didn't expect you to give me such a big surprise." He paused for a moment before continuing. "Who are you?" "Your Highness the Pope. Does it really matter who I am? More importantly, I saved Eris's life," Mellad said quietly. On the night of the trial day, he had saved Arsis in the most impossible situation, and his hidden strength had also been completely exposed. This news could not be hidden at all. However, Mellad had finally brought Arsis back to the secret base of the Vatican. For him, the exposure of his identity was no longer a big deal. The most important thing was that with the exposure of his identity, some plans that had been quietly changed had to be carried out by him. For example, convincing the Pope. In fact, if you hadn't hidden your strength and joined forces with Arsis, the situation might not have been like this. The Pope said with a pleasant expression, "You betrayed the glory of God and brought great losses to the Vatican." "Why?" Mellad was silent for a while, then shook his head with a wry smile. "Betrayal is a sin," the Pope said slowly, "but God is merciful. He will forgive your sin and allow you to enter the kingdom of God. Go repent, Mellad." In the flickering candlelight, he snapped his fingers. An incomparably huge sense of crisis suddenly permeated. If this chapter is not over, please turn the page. The bottom of the abyss enveloped Mellad. Deadly danger came at him from all directions. He subconsciously began to step back. A roar that was close to madness suddenly cut through the night sky. The entire palace shook violently from the roar. All the light in the hall shattered in an instant. Mellad suddenly opened his eyes. The Pope was standing not far from him, The flickering candlelight was still there, but it was much smaller. He had already knelt in front of the statue of God, holding a steel knife in his hand, and had already cut open the skin on his chest. Blood flowed down. Mellad only needed to put in a little more strength, and he could pierce his heart with his own hands. In an instant, Mellad broke out in a cold sweat. After the trial day, Mellad and Arcis immediately entered the secret base of the Vatican in Recchi City. The Pope prayed at the first opportunity. This time, the prayer was not for an hour or a day, but for a few days and nights. Even when the other members of the Vatican officially left Recchi City, the Pope did not move. The prayer continued until just now. After the prayer, the Pope was not weak. Instead, his essence, chi, and spirit had completely reached the peak. In his spiritual domain, as long as he wanted, Mellad would be in danger at every step, and he would not even have the ability to fight back. Was this the transcendent realm? Mellad's breathing was rapid. The fear of walking on the edge of life and death turned into extreme anger in an instant. He suddenly raised his head and looked at the Pope. He said in a fierce voice, "Your Majesty the Pope, you want to kill me? How dare you kill me? It's you who needs to repent." The Pope's voice was gentle and calm. "Okay, repent. Use my own life?" Mellad laughed loudly. "How about now? I'm still alive. You can't kill me. This is God's will." The Pope said slowly, "God has given you life. You should thank God." Mellad stared at the Pope. Sweat and blood continuously flowed from his body. The Pope looked at Mellad quietly, his eyes deep and bottomless. After an unknown period of time, Mellad took a deep breath, stretched out his hand, and drew a cross in front of his chest. The Pope smiled with satisfaction. "I like your attitude now." He poured himself a glass of water and took a sip. God created all things. In front of the great glory, everyone must remain in awe. He poured another glass of water and handed it to Mellad. "So who on earth are you?" Mellad looked at the glass of water, and did not dare to take it for a moment. In the Pope's spiritual domain, even though he was an expert who was infinitely close to the peak of the invincible realm, he did not dare to be sure of his current state, let alone believe his own perception. In his sight, he saw the water that the Pope handed over, but who knew what it was? He took a deep breath, gritted his teeth, and said, "It doesn't matter who I am. I want to know your identity." "You refuse to answer. That's arrogance," the Pope said in a gentle tone. Arrogance was a sin. Mellad hesitated for a moment and said slowly, "I'm a follower." The Pope's body suddenly stiffened for a moment. The candlelight around him also seemed to be slightly shaking. "Follower?" His tone was a little surprised. "Whose follower?" "Of course, His Majesty's follower." Mellad said calmly, "Your Majesty the Pope, I came back this time and brought back His Highness Arcis to show our sincerity. Our Majesty wants to cooperate with the Vatican and conspire with the overall situation of Eastern Europe." "Your Majesty? Your Majesty," the Pope repeated twice and took a deep look at Mellad. "Which Majesty?" "The Duke of the Dark World. This chapter is not over. Please turn the page." There were only two recognized majesties, Sword Emperor Wang Tianzong and the Pope. Now the majesty behind Mellad was obviously not Wang Tianzong. "I don't know," the follower replied in a calm tone. The Pope narrowed his eyes and suddenly smiled. "Can I understand it this way? You betrayed the Vatican, and the majesty who made you betray the Vatican is your real master. You don't even know who he is?" "It doesn't matter," Mellad said calmly. "I don't care what his identity is, but he can give me what I want." "What do you want?" the Pope suddenly asked seriously. Mellad smiled self-deprecatingly. "The Vatican can't give me what I want." The Pope fell silent. "I don't trust such cooperation." The Pope was silent for a long time before he said calmly, "But I don't mind you telling me what I can get by cooperating with His Majesty." "What you can get depends on what you want and what you are willing to pay," Mellad said meaningfully. The Pope smiled and said calmly, "Before I have a complete plan, I'm not willing to pay anything. But you can try to persuade me with your life." The meaning of these words couldn't be more obvious. Mellad was in the Pope's territory and could only be controlled by the Pope. If the cooperation today failed, Melad naturally couldn't live. Melad thought about it seriously and said calmly, His Majesty can give you the theocracy that the Vatican has always wanted. He said calmly, the theocracy of the whole of Eastern Europe, the Eastern Church, has been destroyed. The faith of all the people in Snow Country, and even the 5 countries in Eastern Europe, can be given to you. Given? The Pope laughed. His laughter was extremely cold. How arrogant! In this world, except for the great God, no one is qualified to give me anything. Then let's change the words. Melad said casually, deal. His Majesty can give you the theocracy that you want the most. The Pope leaned against the sofa and said slowly, Why does His Majesty think that he can give me these things? He looked at Melad and said meaningfully, the 5 countries in Eastern Europe are Li Tianlan's world. Up until now, no one can deny this. Melad nodded. The 5 countries in Eastern Europe do belong to Li Tianlan. But sometimes, in sensitive times, the direction of the 5 countries in Eastern Europe is decided by Zhongzhou State. Zhongzhou State. The Pope muttered to himself thoughtfully. As for Snow Country, the Vatican's roots in Snow Country are not shallow. When the general situation is settled, His Majesty will naturally help from behind and let the entire Vatican be unimpeded in Snow Country. Melad continued. The Pope looked at Melad, and his eyes became calmer and calmer. Melad hesitated for a moment and said slowly, Your Majesty, if you agree to cooperate with us, we can show enough sincerity now. Sincerity? The Pope gently raised the corner of his mouth. For example, the Polar Ground Alliance. Melad said calmly, If you are willing, the entire Polar Ground Alliance will be our sincerity to the Vatican. The Pope's body suddenly shook for a moment. If you are willing, maybe we should change places now. Melad said lightly. Where? The Pope narrowed his eyes and finally became serious. Mormons. The Pope lowered his head and thought for a long time. Then he slowly said, If we can cooperate, what do you want? In the darkness, Melad laughed and made threatening gestures. He looked at the Pope and calmly put forward his request. We want the Knights Templars. End of this chapter. Bookmark for easier reading. Chapter 561. The Polar Ground Alliance collapsed with a bang. But this super dark force, which used to dominate Eastern Europe and could be called the most bloated organization, still had unimaginable interests within it. Even today, after 2 of the 4 major families in Eastern Europe were destroyed and the other 2 changed their positions. As the saying goes, a centipede dies but it doesn't fall down. Today the general framework of the Polar Ground Alliance still existed, and its internal structure was chaotic. However, from another perspective, as long as there were experts to sort things out, there would still be countless useful people in the Polar Ground Alliance. The remaining Polar Ground Alliance, as the sincerity of cooperation between the mysterious His Majesty and the Vatican, was indeed a big deal. But the other party's big deal also meant a big appetite. It was just as Melad had said. We want the Knights Templars. The Pope looked at Melad quietly, and was silent for a long time. The other party's big deal was beyond imagination, and the other party's request was also outrageous. After a long time, the Pope slowly opened his mouth and wondered, Are you crazy? His Majesty said that we are worth it. Melad said calmly, Think about Eastern Europe at this time. You don't need to worry about the 5 countries in Eastern Europe. His Majesty will put pressure on Li Tianlan and Zhongzhou State. You just want the religious power of the 5 countries in Eastern Europe. As long as His Majesty gives enough pressure, Li Tianlan, who is eager to develop his own core power, can only compromise. In addition to the 5 countries in Eastern Europe, if the Polar Ground Alliance is used by the Vatican's chances of winning will also be extremely great. The faith of the whole of Eastern Europe belongs to the Vatican. In contrast, how is the Knights Templars not worth it? It's worth it indeed. The Pope said lightly, But why should I believe that you can give me the Polar Ground Alliance? Nothing is taken for free. Melad paused, and a very strange light flashed in his eyes. If the Vatican wants to get the Polar Ground Alliance, it needs to do something. For example, the Pope asked with great interest. The current Polar Ground Alliance, with the destruction of the Violet and Morton families, the Qin clan and Rekvia's change of position, is extremely chaotic internally, but in fact, Snow Country has occupied a great advantage, and everyone can see this. The Pope nodded. There were almost no powerful countries in Eastern Europe. Snow Country could be said to be the only top international hegemon country in Eastern Europe. They occupied the world's largest territory. They were tough, greedy, and aggressive. The strong desire to fight seemed to be engraved in their bones and blood. Great changes had taken place in the four great families, and the Polar Ground Alliance had collapsed. The higher-ups and important figures of the Polar Ground Alliance had already regarded Snow Country as their best place to rely on. At present, the reason why the Polar Ground Alliance was so chaotic was that with the great changes of the four great families, they were splitting internally. Today, most of the power of the Polar Ground Alliance had fallen to Snow Country, but within them, the supporters of more than a dozen other countries also occupied a certain proportion. The most important thing was that the Qin clan and Rekvia had united and won a considerable part of the power within the Polar Ground Alliance. Now this power could be said to be the biggest stumbling block for Snow Country to control the Polar Ground Alliance, and this power undoubtedly belonged to Zhongzhou State at this time. The Pope glanced at Mellad and asked, "So, you have the confidence to persuade Snow Country? Or convince Zhongzhou State?" He thought about it, shook his head and continued, "Is it Snow Country? Li Tianlan would definitely not let go of the power of the Polar Ground Alliance that belonged to Zhongzhou State. In this way, the biggest possibility was that the mysterious His Majesty had the confidence to persuade Snow Country? In fact, His Majesty has already persuaded Snow Country." Melad's body gradually relaxed. "Now the whole Snow Country, His Majesty is waiting for me to persuade you." He looked at the Pope and said meaningfully, "The cooperation is right in front of us, and it only needs you to reach out once. This chapter is not over, please turn the page." The eyebrows of the Pope slightly raised as he slowly said, "Before this, we already had the intention to cooperate with them. From the current situation, we are the only choice of the Snow Empire. Since that is the case, why should I rely on you to cooperate with the Snow Empire?" What he said was completely true. Nowadays, the whole of Eastern Europe was in a state of insecurity. The situation was just like East Island more than 3 years ago, or even more serious than East Island. As the strongest country in Eastern Europe, Snow Country had to make a choice and invite a force that could stabilize the situation of the Dark World in Eastern Europe to Snow Country. At the same time, it could stabilize its position and also contend against the pressure brought by Zhongzhou State. Nowadays, looking at all the major forces in the world, only the Vatican met this standard. And relatively speaking, the Vatican didn't want much. What they wanted was faith. At least for the time being, there was no conflict of interest. If the two sides cooperated, they could rest assured of each other in the short term. "You said it before." "That was before." Mellad explained patiently. "The president of Snow Country was born in the Violet family, and the Violet family has a close relationship with the Eastern Church. Is the intention to cooperate at that time really credible?" "Well, even if it is credible, at that time His Highness Arsis was still in his peak state. As for now," he shrugged. "It's a pity." The Pope's eyes were slightly cold. "So you deliberately let Arsis be seriously injured, but then saved him?" Mellad was silent. He didn't mind exposing his identity, but he had to sit back and watch Arsis be seriously injured. He couldn't explain this kind of thing. "But even so, we are still the only choice of Snow Country," the Pope said indifferently. "Compared with any force that Snow Country can invite, we want even less. You still don't understand. What Snow Country really wants to invite is not some force, but experts. With the foundation of the Snow Empire, they only lack experts. It's just that most of the experts today have their own standpoint, so they want to invite other forces. No matter how you look at it, the current Vatican is not the best choice for the Snow Empire. The best choice for the Snow Empire is us, because compared to the Vatican, our strength has not formed yet, and we want less." The Pope's eyes slightly narrowed. What Snow Country needed now was indeed experts. If an Invincible Realm expert who was close to the peak of the Invincible Realm, but had no clear position joined Snow Country, Snow Country would probably give him the most luxurious treatment at all costs. In that case, they didn't need to invite other forces. To say the least, Mellad, whose own force had not been formed yet, and His Majesty behind him were much better than the Vatican. As long as Snow Country paid the price, the mysterious His Majesty's force would develop in Snow Country in the future, and it would be the local force of Snow Country. Regardless of His Majesty's strength, Mellad alone was enough to stabilize the current situation of Snow Country. But now His Majesty wanted to use Snow Country to exchange for Knights Templars. Obviously, compared with Snow Country, whose strength was intertwined and entangled, His Majesty, whose own foundation was insufficient, didn't want to be involved in the current cooperation and future game with Snow Country. He didn't have the confidence to participate, but the Vatican had the confidence. The weight of Knights Templars they wanted was naturally not as great as that of the whole Snow Country. But Knights Templars was a relatively young force in the Dark World. Its organization was simple, and its core was clear at a glance. Besides, it had Mellad's qualifications in the Holy Disarmament Corps. Knights Templars was undoubtedly the best to control. Even if its scale was a little small, its potential was endless. If Knights Templars were in his hands, it would be a real sea and sky for His Majesty. The Pope thought of His Majesty's conclusion. We are worthy of each other. Finally, he nodded. Get ready. Let's go to Mormon's. Mellad's face bloomed with joy and a bright smile. He gave a somewhat exaggerated salute and said, I'll arrange it right away. Your Majesty the Pope. He placed a small bottle in his hand in front of the Pope. What's this? Teaching, this chapter is not over. Please turn the page. The Emperor raised his eyebrows slightly. A small gift, a very magical medicine. Mellad smiled and said, His Highness Arasus's injury is very serious. But if the Vatican wants to completely control the Polar Ground Alliance, I'm afraid there will be a conflict with the power of Zhongzhou State. His Highness Arasus's power is very important. This medicine can't make him return to his peak state, but within about 12 hours after taking the medicine, it can make him recover at least half of his combat capability. The only drawback is that the period of weakness is very long, very long. Your Majesty the Pope can use it at your discretion. Give it to me. An incomparably deep voice suddenly sounded behind Mellad. The Pope and Mellad turned their heads at the same time. In the dark corner of the hall, an incomparably burly figure walked over. His figure was steady, but as he moved forward, the candlelight in the room began to shake slightly. The cold wind blew in, but it was melted by the aura of this figure. The temperature of the entire hall seemed to be rising. The cold wind seemed to be burning, turning into an angry flame. Arsus. Ever since he had been rescued by Mellad, Arsus had been in a coma. He had only just woken up. The roar just now had imperceptibly interrupted the Pope's spiritual domain, which could be considered to have saved Mellad's life. Mellad bowed slightly. Arsus didn't say a word. His eyes were fixed on the bottle of potion that Mellad had put down. His body swayed as he took a step forward and reached for it. In his sight, the bottle of potion suddenly began to shine. Countless pure rays of light gathered together and turned into a silver cross. Arsus subconsciously withdrew his hand and looked at the Pope. It's not the time yet. The Pope waved his hand, and the potion turned into a cross again. Arasus's face was distorted. Endless fury almost completely drowned his reason. I'm going to kill them. I must kill them all. He bellowed word by word. He was one of the strongest people standing at the peak of the Dark World. An expert at the peak of the invincible realm. As the Saint War Angel of the Vatican, he had never been as embarrassed as he had been on the trial day. As one of the most qualified figures to decide the battle situation on the trial day, in such an important battlefield, his role was infinitely close to zero. All his dignity and pride seemed to have been completely shattered in that battle. Arasus's eyes trembled a little, and he almost lost his mind. Mellad lowered his head and suddenly said, Your Highness, instead of thinking about revenge, we might as well study why such a situation happened that night. His eyes looked at the shimmer floating under his feet and he said blandly, You've been crowned by His Majesty the Pope. How could you be hypnotized by a mere patriarch in Eastern Europe? Isn't that strange? Arsus was stunned for a moment. Why? He slowly turned his head and looked at Mellad, his eyes bloodshot. It's very simple. Someone destroyed your state of coronation. Mellad said calmly. And the means are extremely brilliant. Such a person knows the coronation very well. And he is also a master in the spiritual field. Who? Arsis suddenly let out a roar. Mellad stopped talking. The Pope sighed deeply and was a little disappointed. He had already known who the so-called traitor was. He was a master in the spiritual field, and he knew the coronation and could get close to Arsis. There were only 2 of them in the world. The Pope was not in Eastern Europe that day, and it was impossible for him to destroy the coronation. So there was only one candidate left. The Holy Virgin of the Vatican. Angel. End of this chapter. Bookmark for easier reading. Chapter 562. It was completely quiet in the hall. Just like the depressing atmosphere before a storm, Arsis suddenly became incomparably quiet. The Pope was quiet and silent, like a statue. Mellad stared at the glimmer on the floor, as if he was lost in thought. Arsis stood there motionless, as if he was stunned. After an unknown period of time, the Pope glanced at Mellad with a deep look in his eyes. Mellad didn't say much, but he said a lot. He didn't try to sow discord. But after telling the truth without batting an eyelid, the Vatican, especially the Pope, had to do something. That was the truth. The coronation of the Pope could greatly improve the will of the person being crowned. In such a state, Arisis's will would be extremely focused from beginning to end. In the case of absolute focus, his reaction, speed, and even strength would be slightly improved. Correspondingly, the physical strength that Arsis needed to consume would be reduced correspondingly. In general, the coronation of the Pope was enough to improve Arisis's combat effectiveness to an obvious level. And such a coronation would also not be affected by any spiritual interference from the outside world. On the night of the trial day, it was impossible for Arsis to be hypnotized. But the impossible had become a reality. Naturally, there was only one reason. That was, there was a traitor within the Vatican. Angel, the dignified Holy Virgin of the Vatican, whose status was second only to the Pope, had betrayed the Vatican. Even the Pope's heart was extremely heavy in the face of this news. He was still hesitating about how to deal with this matter, but Mellad had already told the truth. Although he didn't mention Angel, Arsis wasn't stupid. How could he not guess who the traitor was? In this way, the Pope had to take action. Go and ask Angel to come over. The Pope was silent for a while and said with some tiredness, I want to see him. At this moment Mellad, who no longer belonged to the Vatican, glanced at Arsis. Arsis stood there, expressionless. He did not say a word and was extremely quiet. Mellad shrugged and said, I'll go now. He slowly turned around and left the hall. The Pope squinted at his back and did not speak for a long time. This was a secret base set up by the Vatican outside Recchi City. To be exact, it was a hidden church built on a beach in the mountains. Its area was limited, so the building did not look magnificent, but its momentum was extremely magnificent. At this time, the Pope lived in the largest hall in the church. As the Holy Virgin of the Vatican, Angel, who had too many choices, only chose a small prayer room. A faint light was burning in the prayer room, and the cross was flickering. Angel, dressed in a white dress, knelt in front of the cross, quiet and holy. When the roar that represented the awakening sounded, Angel had just finished his prayer. She opened her eyes, but her body did not move. She only quietly experienced the rage and hatred contained in that roar. His Highness Arsis is awake. A strange voice rang out behind Angel. The voice was very soft, but it was extremely cold. It was extremely uncomfortable to listen to it. A slender figure shrouded in a black robe walked to the candlelight from the darkness. Intentionally or unintentionally, she blocked the door to the prayer room. Angel stood up, her posture elegant. Her voice was calm and calm. In that case, His Highness the Pope should have made up his mind. The figure in the black robe was silent for a while, then nodded and said, Yes. She paused and continued, In our opinion, His Majesty has made up his mind. Why? Angel smiled and turned her head. Behind the white veil, her eyes were bright and clear. Just because you're here? As long as I'm here, Your Highness, you can't leave. This is the will of the Pope. To some extent, This is also the attitude of His Highness the Pope. The figure in the black robe said softly. You're wrong, Rhea. Angel sighed faintly. This is the secret base of the Vatican. At least the surrounding area is within His Majesty's spiritual domain. He can sense everything here. Without his permission, it's impossible for me to leave, and I can't escape. He sent you here to monitor me to test the attitude of the other higher-ups of the Vatican. So far, I think he has received enough feedback, and it's time to make up his mind. Rhea, dressed in black, trembled slightly. Angel looked at her and said softly, So you're not as important as you think. Rhea, the chief high priest of the Holy Punishment Priests. In terms of duty, she was Angel's right-hand woman, but in fact, she could be considered the most powerful candidate in the Holy Punishment Priests to keep the Holy Lady in check. The Pope had sent her to keep an eye on Angel. This task had excited Rhea for a long time. She even fantasized about the possibility of becoming the next Holy Lady of the Vatican. But only now did she know that the Pope's spiritual domain could cover this place. Thinking of some of her actions in the past few days, for some reason, her face was a little pale. Angel did not continue. She just turned to look at the cross in front of her and said softly, Tell me, which one is more important, the Holy Lady of the Vatican or the Saint War Angel? Rhea did not answer. She did not need to answer anything. The Holy Lady was second only to the Pope, so her importance was naturally greater than the Saint War Angel. But this was only on the surface. Within the Vatican, the Holy Lady represented faith. The Saint War Angel, on the other hand, represented real combat power. In fact, which one was more important depended on the situation of the Vatican at the time, and the will of the Pope. Rhea gritted her teeth and said respectfully, His Highness the Pope is fair. Fair. Angel nodded. Oh, fair. You did something wrong, and you must be punished. Rhea's voice was sinister. Obviously, she was saying that the question of which was more important was meaningless. The most important thing was that Angel had destroyed Erisis's coronation state, directly causing Erisis's serious injury and the Vatican's failure. Such a mistake was the most important. I didn't think it would be like this either. Angel sighed softly. Her tone was extremely complicated. It seemed like she was telling Rhea, but also explaining to the Pope. This was the first time Angel had explained since the trial day. Although the Pope was not in front of her, he was in his spiritual domain. Angel believed that he could hear everything here. Why? In a trance, there seemed to be another voice, extremely far away. Then Rhea's voice came. Unexpected? What were you thinking at the time, Your Highness? It's meaningless to talk about it. Angel smiled self-deprecatingly. Even from our current standpoint, it's no good for us to fall out with Li Tianlan. His Majesty and Arsis both saw the huge benefits of Europe after Rothschild lost its leader. Such benefits could even make them give up Eastern Europe. But in fact, with the relationship between Rothschild and the Wang family of Beihai, even if Wang Tianzong didn't show up that day, would Li Tianlan really dare to kill them? To say the least, even if Paul and King Tong died, Li Tianlan and Zhongzhou state would not be willing to make a wedding dress for the Vatican. If Arsis succeeded that night, Li Tianlan would definitely fall out with him as soon as possible. At that time, it would be a problem whether the Vatican could go out of Eastern Europe or not. This problem had been mentioned on the night of the trial day, but it was not recognized by the Pope and Arsis. That was why she secretly took action and destroyed Erisis's coronation state. At that time, she just wanted to prevent Arsis from completely killing Paul and King Tong. In her plan, after severely injuring Rothschild, she would first stabilize Li Tianlan. The two sides would conspire to Eastern Europe and then attack Rothschild. However, she really didn't expect what would happen next. Arsis, who was not in the coronation state, would actually be hypnotized. In the end, she would achieve nothing and the Vatican would also suffer a crushing defeat. This was really the worst result. Even if she fell out with Li Tianlan that night, it would probably be the same. I'm afraid it's more than that, isn't it? Melod's voice suddenly sounded from outside the door. I think the main reason is that Your Highness doesn't want to be enemies with Zhongzhou state. Your past is there, and so is your deep love. It's in a certain assassin. If you have a choice, you will definitely not fall out with Zhongzhou state, and even destroy His Highness Erisis's coronation state. Is that right? Angel suddenly turned around. Under the gauze, her eyes fell on Melad's face with anger. Melad was slightly stunned. Then he shrugged his shoulders. He bowed and said with a smile, "Your Highness, His Majesty the Pope invites you in." Angel's body trembled slightly. After a long silence, she slowly said, "Let's go." Rhea made way for him. Angel walked out of the prayer room and walked to the hall. It was dark ahead. In the darkness, no one could tell whether the danger of fire or frost began to spread gradually and occupied her whole consciousness. The church was getting closer and closer. Melad, who could be considered to have officially separated from the Vatican, finally stopped. He looked at Angel's back with a complicated look in his eyes. In his sight, the fluttering white dress was completely swallowed up by the darkness in the hall. Angel's face was still calm. He glanced at Arsis and then bowed slightly to the Pope. The Pope looked at him in silence. In the almost frozen darkness, the flickering light of the candlelight gradually expanded. The Pope's voice sounded, "Angel, you did wrong." "Yes." Angel was silent for a while. "I'm willing to take responsibility," and whoosh. The ice wind by the sea whistled in with the wind and rain. A huge figure suddenly appeared beside Angel. Pa. With a crisp sound, Angel's delicate body flew out directly. A smear of blood and teeth fell to the ground. The veil fluttered and fell in the darkness. Boom. The whole hall shook with a loud bang. Angel's body hit the pillar of the hall and slowly slid down. Under the white veil, the beautiful face of the Holy Virgin Angel was a little blurred in the darkness. Blood flowed from the corner of her mouth. It was a shocking sight. "Take responsibility." Erisis's furious roar echoed throughout the hall. "How can you take responsibility? What right do you have to take responsibility? Can you afford to take responsibility for such a serious loss of the Vatican? You dirty and lowly woman. When I knew that you were not a virgin, I should have persuaded His Majesty to purify you." Arsis stared at Angel and smiled viciously. "It's not too late now. Go to hell, bitch." The candlelight spread again. All of Erisis's roars were drowned in the candlelight. Outside the hall, Melad slowly turned around and walked in the other direction. He climbed a hillside around the church and looked at the waves in the darkness. The wind and rain fell, and all the sounds became extremely messy. Melad took out his mobile phone and dialed a number. The call was quickly answered. "Is it done?" The mysterious His Majesty's voice sounded on the phone. "Angel has gone to see the Pope," Melad said respectfully. "From now on, there should be no Holy Virgin in the Vatican." The mysterious His Majesty smiled and said, "Oh, how will the Pope deal with Angel?" "It depends on the intentions of all the higher-ups of the Vatican. But if there are no accidents, the Vatican will purify her," Melad said in a low voice. After all, he had stayed in the Vatican for many years. When it came to purification, his tone was a little unnatural. Purification. This was the cruelest criminal law within the Vatican, and it was a criminal law that had never been used in recent years. It was usually used to deal with heresy that had caused great losses to the Vatican. The Vatican would first inject an extremely precious drug into the person who was being purified. This drug would not have any direct increase in combat power, but it could make the injected person's spirit unprecedentedly concentrated. And his spirit was absolutely concentrated. This also meant that the other party would always be awake, and his body would become extremely sensitive to external pain. Then the saint warriors would tie the other party to the cross, light the fire, and burn the body. The purified heresy would always be in the most sober state, and would be burned alive when his perception was extremely sensitive. This was purification. His Majesty was silent for a while, then clicked his tongue and said, "It's really cruel. The dignity of God cannot be offended," Melad said subconsciously. He shook his head self-deprecatingly and said softly, "Your Majesty, I don't understand why you are targeting Her Highness Angel. If I hadn't exposed her tonight, the Pope might not have made up his mind to purify Angel. You can't bear it?" His Majesty's voice was a little playful. Melad shook his head. "No, it's just," he gave a wry smile and didn't say anything in the end. "I'm not targeting her. In fact, if I ascend to the peak of the dark world in the future, the Vatican will definitely be one of my most troublesome opponents. From this point of view, it's actually not a bad thing for Angel to control the Holy Punishment Priest group. She's a very kind woman, and it can even be said that she's simple. She deserves the title of Holy Virgin. I have a good impression of her. With her existence, we will have less trouble in the future. After all, with her character, she won't cultivate too many troublesome fanatics. His Majesty's tone was a little emotional. But these are all things that need to be considered in the future. Now, how can I care about the future? I must solve the trouble in front of me. It's very troublesome and also very important. What trouble? Mellat said subconsciously. Tell me, if Li Tianlan leaves Eastern Europe, who is the most qualified to take over Li Tianlan's position? His Majesty suddenly asked. Mellat was silent for a moment subconsciously. His Majesty had already given the answer. It can only be tribulation. Don't underestimate tribulation. In Eastern Europe, not only me, but everyone else can't do anything. Jiang Shangyu can't beat him either. Sometimes his deterrent power is no less than that of the peak of the invincible realm. He has to die. Only when he dies can everyone feel at ease. If Angel is purified, it's impossible for tribulation to remain indifferent. Mellat said. So to purify Angel, you want to get rid of tribulation with the help of the Vatican. I told you, didn't I? As I said, I have a grudge with Arcis. But in order to cooperate with the Vatican, I can only let you save his life. He saved his life, but it doesn't mean that he can live. I used the knife of the Vatican to get rid of tribulation, and I also used the sharp edge of tribulation to get rid of Arcis. Since we can cooperate with the Vatican, it's time for Arcis to die. His Majesty said calmly. This. Mellat hesitated for a moment. Can tribulation kill Arcis? Tribulation had a very high evaluation in the Dark World. He was the only assassin of the invincible realm in the Dark World. But on the Divine and Holy list, his evaluation was not high, and he didn't even enter the Divine list. Arcis, on the other hand, was a real expert at the peak of the invincible realm. Even if he was seriously injured, tribulation should not be his match. What's more, he had just left Arcis a bottle of potion that could temporarily restore most of his combat capability. I said, don't underestimate tribulation. His Majesty's voice was a little distant. At present, it only depends on whether he knows how to let go. All right. Mellat smiled bitterly. If tribulation is really lucky enough to kill Arcis, what about our cooperation with the Vatican? What cooperation? His Majesty's voice was full of innocence. Mellat suddenly felt that the ice wind between heaven and earth was really cold, cold to the bone. Conspiring with the overall situation of Eastern Europe is something that the Vatican and other superpowers are interested in. What does it have to do with me? His Majesty chuckled. Look at the current Samsara Palace. They cooperate with the Purgatory of Heaven capital for the benefit of the chaos in Eastern Europe. We cooperate with the Vatican for the benefit as well. But the so-called benefit is, after all, just something said. Except for those who are persuaded, no one will care. Mellat suddenly couldn't laugh anymore. Samsara Palace, he murmured to himself. What Samsara Palace wants is a new era. She doesn't care about the benefit of Eastern Europe. It doesn't matter who she gives it to. His Majesty said. What about you? Mellat asked. Me. His Majesty laughed. Why don't you understand? What I really want is Knights Templar. Now he had more than one invincible realm expert around him. But strictly speaking, the relationship between the two sides was not the kind of relationship that could be completely trusted. His Majesty had no so-called foundation or heritage, so what he really wanted was a foundation that could allow him to develop. There was such a foundation in Eastern Europe. But he couldn't take away the 5 countries in Eastern Europe. He couldn't take Snow Country. As for the territories outside Snow Country and the 5 countries in Eastern Europe, they were also entangled. In contrast, in the whole Dark World, only Knights Templar was the simplest. But the organization of Knights Templar was also the most streamlined and comprehensive. As a vassal agency of the Vatican, Most of the complicated internal entanglements were concentrated in the Vatican. The internal environment of Knights Templar could be said to be the simplest force. Such a foundation was what His Majesty needed the most. So he cooperated with the Purgatory of Heaven capital. He cooperated with Wang Qinglei. Jiang Shangyu entered Eastern Europe. Some of these collaborations had been implemented, and some had not been implemented. But it didn't matter, because even if these were just cooperation intentions, they could become bargaining chips in his hands. He used these bargaining chips to persuade Snow Country. Then Mellad exposed his strength and persuaded the Vatican. Snow Country cooperated with the Vatican, and His Majesty would also cooperate with the Vatican. In this way, the Vatican got Snow Country and the broken but still bloated Polar Ground Alliance. But His Majesty got the entire Knights Templar. Mellad suddenly felt that something was wrong. The cooperation this time was simple and vague. Snow Country paid most of the power of the Polar Ground Alliance for this. And the Vatican paid Knights Templar for this. Then what did His Majesty pay? His Majesty finally. It seemed that he paid some saliva? And it was Mellad who paid the saliva to persuade the Vatican. He held his mobile phone and was silent for a long time. Then he said seriously, "Your Majesty, does this count as getting something for nothing?" Chapter 563. On the second day after Li Huaqing arrived in Reki City, the atmosphere in the whole city became extremely subtle. The excitement of the people welcoming the friends from Zhongzhou State gradually subsided. The media, which had been singing praises for a whole day yesterday, began to analyze the huge business opportunities and economic effects brought to Wulan State, and even the whole of Eastern Europe after the close connection between Zhongzhou State and Wulan State. The major media openly described the welcome dinner held for Zhongzhou State as the top summit in Eastern Europe and Zhongzhou State. It seemed that in order to confirm this statement, Wulan State also directly responded. In the airport of Reki City, civil aviation flights to all parts of the world were temporarily grounded. The international airport of Reki City seemed to have become a paradise for private jets. From Li Huaqing's arrival until noon the next day, one private jet after another landed in the international airport of Reki City. It could be said that there was an endless stream of them. The patriarchs of the wealthy families in Eastern Europe, who could stand on the stage, gathered in Reki City. They did not come alone. Each of them brought a professional negotiating team and prepared detailed plans in advance. Top bodyguards, business elites, and wealthy families kept pouring out of the airport. As soon as they arrived in Reki City, they used all their connections to ask for a meeting with the delegation members of Zhongzhou State. Some of the wealthy families had roughly the same intention of cooperation with Zhongzhou State. Before they could see the distinguished guests of Zhongzhou State, they had become competitors with each other, and even had several conflicts. However, no matter how they fought with each other, when it came to Zhongzhou State, everyone behaved extremely meekly. These people who stood at the top of Eastern Europe were undoubtedly the ones who could really see the current situation clearly. But they were all businessmen. They used the power of capital to do whatever they wanted in the world of capital. This was a world that was purer than the dark world to some extent. In the world of capitalists, there was no so-called hot-bloodedness or a sense of belonging to the country. What they wanted was only interests. Therefore, they knew that Zhongzhou State did not come to Eastern Europe for any cooperation at all. Its fundamental purpose was to plunder. But when the media sang praises of merits, these people were more enthusiastic than anyone else. Whether it was plunder or cooperation, for them, as long as it was beneficial, it was good. So in less than a day, Li Tianlan received countless gifts. There were all kinds of gifts. There were valuable ancient armors that had been collected by the big families for decades, or even hundreds of years, famous swords used by famous generals in Eastern Europe, and some medals with great history. After knowing that Dongqing Rushi was by Li Tianlan's side, some extremely expensive gemstone jewelry were also sent by the big families. The top economic circle in Eastern Europe had always been extremely strange, or it could be said that it was a common problem in all capitalist countries. There were very few wealthy families at the top. For example, the former four families occupied most of the resources in Eastern Europe. With the benefit chain they created, some small wealthy families rose. The so-called prosperity in Eastern Europe was supported by the four families and many small families. As for some middle-level wealthy families, there was little room for them to develop in Eastern Europe. When many small wealthy families sent gifts to Li Tianlan, just by looking at the gift list, the approximate evaluation of professionals had already exceeded 9 figures. Li Tianlan could be said to have made a windfall. Li Tianlan did not stand on ceremony and accepted all the gifts. In fact, it had nothing to do with corruption. Behind each gift was a network in Eastern Europe. When many networks were intertwined, they became a network that could cover the whole of Eastern Europe. No matter how Zhongzhou State treated Li Tianlan now, this chapter is not over. Please turn the page. It was so subtle. At least in the future, the 5 countries in Eastern Europe would be Li Tianlan's world. Li Tianlan did not trust these small wealthy families, and these wealthy families did not trust Li Tianlan either. Accepting this gift was the first step in contact between the two sides. With a good start, all the exchanges in the future would naturally be able to gradually deepen. The Qin clan, which had now become the largest wealthy family in Eastern Europe, did not send any gifts. But Qin Dongqiao, the patriarch of the Qin clan, had already appeared in the Manlisai Hotel in Reki City early in the morning. The first person he looked for was Li Tianlan, not Li Huaqing. This also showed the attitude of the Qin clan to a certain extent. However, he seemed to have appeared a little too early. He arrived at the hotel at 5 o'clock in the morning. It was not until nearly 8 o'clock in the morning that Li Tianlan appeared in front of Qin Dongqiao. Li Tianlan looked a little tired, but his smile was still calm. He shook hands with Qin Dongqiao and sat down on the sofa. He seemed to be a little apologetic. He shook his head and said with a smile, "Mr. Qin, I'm sorry for the neglect." He had not come back since he left the office of the president yesterday. It was already late at night after he chatted with the master of Samsara Palace. Then Dongcheng Rushi sent him another document. When he finished reading it overnight, it was nearly 3 o'clock. Qin Weibai had been staying by his side after taking a shower. While he was reading the document, she was watching him. He could not let down the beautiful scenery and the beautiful woman on such a good day. Li Tianlan forced himself to read the document calmly, and immediately turned into a beast. He held the delicate body that was enough to make the world crazy and tossed it until dawn. Even when Qin Dongqiao had just arrived in Reki City, the last war between him and Qin Weibai had not ended. Li Tianlan received the call, but he was too lazy to move at that time. He slept for 2 hours in a daze. Finally, he struggled to get up and came to the Manlisai Hotel. "Your Highness is busy and has to take care of everything. I'm half the host. I'm a little ashamed that I didn't come until today." Qin Dongqiao shook his head with a smile. "I'll remember the Lin clan's contribution this time. Mr. Qin, you and I don't need to be so polite." Li Tianlan laughed. Dongcheng Rushi came over with 2 cups of tea. When she put the tea beside Li Tianlan, her delicate little nose twitched. The unfamiliar but unforgettable fragrance entered her nostrils. Dongcheng Rushi glanced at Li Tianlan and pursed her lips. Li Tianlan was a little embarrassed. He coughed and said directly, "Mr. Qin, did you come here today for tonight's dinner?" "Of course," Qin Dongqiao said with a smile. This patriarch of a wealthy family, who was deeply rooted in Eastern Europe beyond everyone's imagination, was in his 50s. Although he was still handsome, his face actually looked a little old. But his eyes were extremely deep, and his behavior was meticulous. His every move was full of energy, with a kind of power of a high position. He was steady, but extremely domineering. "This is only part of the reason, and it's not even the main reason," Qin Dongqiao said softly. "The Qin clan cooperates with your highness. I believe that no matter what, your highness will never treat your friends badly." This was not a retreat for the sake of advancing, but a real serious explanation. Tonight's dinner in Reki City, to some extent, was the beginning of Zhongzhou State's division of the interests of the 5 Eastern European countries. All the interests of the 5 Eastern European countries would be held in the hands of Zhongzhou State. Zhongzhou State would use these interests to cooperate with the local wealthy families in Eastern Europe, digest them, and then tie them to their own chariots. This was a banquet, crazy and unimaginable. When the cooperation between Zhongzhou state and many wealthy families gradually deepened, and after completely squeezing the interests of the 5 Eastern European countries, Zhongzhou state would also start from each wealthy family to conquer, plunder, and squeeze the interests of other Eastern European countries besides the 5 Eastern European countries. These patriarchs of the wealthy families might not be able to see this, but sadly no one cared about it at all. As Li Tianlan's staunchest ally, the weight of the Qin clan could not be overstated. Qin Dongqiao did not have to come to such a dinner. If he really came here because of the dinner, it not only showed that he did not trust Li Tianlan, but also showed that he was narrow-minded and wanted to make people laugh. The main reason I came here today is to meet Your Highness. In addition, I am also very interested in some things in Your Highness's hands. I don't know if Your Highness can part with them. Qin Dongqiao said tentatively. What things? Li Tianlan felt a little strange. I heard that Your Highness received a lot of gifts yesterday. I think if those small families are not stupid, they should all know that giving gifts is just the beginning. Since Your Highness has accepted them, you naturally have to wait for their further expressions. So if there is no accident, soon the real sincerity of each family should arrive. And what the Qin clan wants is this sincerity. Even a part of it is good. Qin Dongqiao said quietly. At this moment he did not give people the feeling of shrewdness, but wisdom. Li Tianlan narrowed his eyes slightly and felt a little emotional. In fact, Qin Dongqiao was still wrong about one thing. The sincerity of each family was not about to arrive. Some of the families who reacted quickly had already sent their sincerity to Li Tianlan as soon as he received the gifts. This so-called sincerity was simple and shocking. Within one day, at least 20 small families wanted to cooperate with Li Tianlan, and were willing to sell a part of their family's core business shares at a low price. The highest one was even willing to sell 45% of its shares to Li Tianlan, and all of them were at a low price. They invited Li Tianlan to jointly develop their family's current core business. No matter how small a wealthy family was, it was still a wealthy family. The core business of these wealthy families was equivalent to some core businesses of the whole of Eastern Europe. This was the information that Li Tianlan saw last night. It could be foreseen that this part of the wealthy families who reacted quickly at present was only the first batch. Perhaps in the afternoon, perhaps in the evening, perhaps in understanding, more and more wealthy families would continuously throw out their core businesses and invite Li Tianlan to jointly develop them. Li Tianlan could not give up these things. They could even be said to be his most important bargaining chip in Eastern Europe. As long as he took over the core businesses of these families, Li Tianlan would be equivalent to holding the core of the whole of Eastern Europe, which was a huge and unimaginable benefit. The only bad thing was that if he wanted to get such benefits, he needed to invest as much in the early stage. No one denied that this was a good thing. Li Tianlan's vision was not shallow enough. He really wanted to eat this big cake. The wealthy families sent their core businesses to him, and he really wanted to take them all. There was no hesitation, no problem. But the problem was, he had no money. End of this chapter. Bookmark for easy reading. Chapter 564. Money was not everything. But it was impossible to do without money. In fact, strictly speaking, Li Tianlan and East Emperor Palace were not poor. Their main source of income came from the investment of the Flourishing Age Fund. This sounded a little mean, but no one who really knew the Flourishing Age Fund dared to say so. The economic strength of the forces invested by the Flourishing Age Fund depended entirely on the support of the Flourishing Age Fund, not the financial strength of the Flourishing Age Fund. What did it mean to be as rich as a country? Han Donglu, the boss of the Flourishing Age Fund, was probably really as rich as a country. For him, the so-called money was really just a string of numbers. When he was so rich, no matter how long the string of numbers was, it was even meaningless. Li Tianlan had received 2 investments from the Flourishing Age Fund for the establishment of East Emperor Palace. If the first investment was the so-called small amount, then the second investment of tens of billions of yuan was enough to be a real big amount. Moreover, the money had been in the account before Li Tianlan came to Eastern Europe. It was in the hands of Ning Qiancheng, and he took it to Tiannan. It was not a small sum of money anywhere. It was just that Li Tianlan wanted too much. The core business of any wealthy family in Eastern Europe, even if it was just a small share, could not be bought with tens of billions of capital under normal circumstances. Now, although they intended to sell it at a low price, it was completely different concepts to have no choice of dependence and tentative cooperation. This low price would not really be so low. With Li Tianlan's current funds, he could probably barely take over the core business of two small families, and this was still under the condition of giving up the investment of Tiannan. Li Tianlan really had no money, but he had a lot of choices. The Dongqing clan and even the entire giant group. The academics. The flourishing age fund. He had chips in his hands, so he had countless choices. At present, what he was going to take over was part of the core business of almost all the families in Eastern Europe, including energy, military, aviation, real estate, media, construction, oil, minerals, automobiles, from the lifeline of the country to the clothing, food, housing, and transportation. All the core industries in Eastern Europe were in front of him. As long as he paid, he could take them away. As long as he had enough money, in the future, Li Tianlan could hold the heart of all Eastern Europe. With such a situation and such a general trend, would he be afraid that no one would invest? Therefore, Li Tianlan was not in a hurry at all. He was not in a hurry to call Han Donglu to ask for additional investment. On the contrary, he was still waiting for calls from the Flourishing Age Fund and many others. Now, the news had only spread for a day and the Qin clan came knocking on their door. 3 days later. 5 days later. More and more people would come to Li Tianlan for cooperation. This was a real big business. In front of Li Tianlan was a big cake, ripe, delicious, with expected benefits that could drive people crazy. This was his best chance since he entered the secular world. He really wanted to use this opportunity to build his own complete team. After a moment of silence, Li Tianlan suddenly smiled and said, "Mr. Qin, I can't rush this matter at the moment. You should understand." "But I'm in a hurry," Qin Dongqiao said with an undisguised wry smile. "I can't wait to negotiate with Her Highness in the next second. As for the price, everything is negotiable." Li Tianlan drank his tea and said calmly, "You don't have to be in such a hurry. It's not a matter of urgency, but a matter of priority. In today's dark world, no one can question Her Highness's future. Now there is such a good opportunity. Everyone understands that at this time, the first one to approach Her Highness is a friend. In the future, they will drink wine and eat meat. The last one to approach can only be a dog, who may not even be able to gnaw the bones hot." Qin Dongqiao was a little emotional. Compared with others, he undoubtedly knew more. After all, the Qin clan could be said to be the first big force to contact Qin Weibai. So this time, Qin Dongqiao did not hesitate at all. He could see the end of this mess, and naturally, he could see Li Tianlan's position in the new era. Li Tianlan's foundation in Wulan State was now unshakable. After completely digesting Wulan State, Zhongzhou State would definitely plunder all the resources in Eastern Europe as soon as possible. His future position in Eastern Europe was completely unimaginable, so countless small families did not hesitate to take out part of their core interests, looking forward to being tied to Li Tianlan. If Li Tianlan took this interest, he would be the future core of Eastern Europe. Those families who cooperated with Li Tianlan could also take advantage of the situation to get more benefits from Zhongzhou State. This was a real win-win situation. As long as they leaned on Li Tianlan and had no other thoughts, they would not take any risks. This chapter is not over. Please turn the page. This was Li Tianlan's future position. For Eastern Europe, if Li Tianlan was stable, Eastern Europe would be stable. For Zhongzhou State, if Eastern Europe was stable, Li Tianlan would be stable. At this moment, Qin Dongqiao thought of the Samsara Palace and the Li family. In fact, he didn't know much about the Li family. The collapse of the Li family was vigorous. But when the aftermath of the collapse swept through Eastern Europe clapped its hands and cheered. At most, it felt a kind of joy after surviving the disaster. The shadow brought by the two highnesses of the Li family, who swept through the whole of Eastern Europe like a gale, had not been eliminated. Otherwise, Wulan State would not be so cowardly today. That was why the Samsara Palace was making arrangements here. Even though the old man of the Li family was no longer in the invincible realm, he was still awe-inspiring. He was making arrangements in Tiannan. That was a gift from the Li family to Li Tianlan. And the Samsara Palace was making arrangements in Eastern Europe. That was a gift from Qin Weibai to Li Tianlan. As long as Li Tianlan took over Eastern Europe and Tiannan, such a foundation was enough to build a new dynasty, even an empire. Mr. Qin, you're too serious. Li Tianlan shook his head and said, those who can support me at this time are all friends. Qin Dongqiao smiled and said quietly, Your Highness, we don't have to be polite. Since Your Highness entered Eastern Europe, the Qin clan has spared no effort in supporting Your Highness. Not to mention that the second brother is still lying in the hospital. The power of the Qin clan is still strangling Violet and Morton. I'm not asking for credit from Your Highness. I just want to say that the Qin clan has never let Your Highness down. So today, I sit in front of Your Highness with a clear conscience. I think the Qin clan is qualified to sit in the same boat as Your Highness. Of course. Li Tianlan smiled without hesitation. He reached out and poured a cup of tea for Qin Dongqiao. He said seriously, I remember everything about the Qin clan. Qin Dongqiao nodded and said softly, In that case, Your Highness, I think we can still talk. Since we are all sensible people, it's more convenient to talk about it. Your Highness has a lot of chips in your hands. These chips are enough for Your Highness to set up a real team in Eastern Europe. The Qin clan can't take all of them, but it's not too much to want to take some, right? At this time, I think I should be able to talk to Your Highness. Li Tianlan smiled and handed Qin Dongqiao a cigarette. He narrowed his eyes and said, What's your intention, Mr. Qin? We don't want much. At present, there are about 4 families that have taken a fancy to you, such as the Collin family. No matter how much they offer you, the Qin clan will bear this number for you, and is willing to give Your Highness 30% more. As for the shares that the Collin family gives you, the Qin clan wants 70%. He looked at Li Tianlan with calm eyes. Li Tianlan held the teacup and looked at Qin Dongqiao with a faint smile. All this seemed to be very good. The Collin family was a big family in Wulan State. It could also be said to be one of the most powerful families in Wulan State, except for Rekvia. In the agreement given to Li Tianlan, the Collin family was willing to sell 30% of its shares to Li Tianlan. Their offer was 15 billion Zhongzhou dollars, and the details could be discussed later. This price was really low. If it was on a normal day, it was hard to say how many shares the Collin family could buy with 15 billion Zhongzhou dollars. In fact, the Collin family would not sell at all. Obviously, the Collin family had great expectations for Li Tianlan's future and cooperation with Zhongzhou State. Now, according to the conditions of the Qin clan, Li Tianlan did not have to pay a penny. The Qin clan would pay the money and give him 30% more. What they wanted was only 70% of the 30% shares. If Li Tianlan operated well, it was equivalent to getting 10% of the Collin family's shares for nothing. It sounded like a bargain. But in fact, the Qin clan was mercilessly demanding an exorbitant price. Even if Li Tianlan did not pay, his status was there. If he wanted to find someone to pay for him, many people would be willing. After all, this was the core interest of countless core areas in Eastern Europe. Without Li Tianlan, the Collin family would not sell these things even if they were beaten to death. When the Qin clan gave money, they wanted to swallow 70% of Li Tianlan's interests. It was a beautiful dream, but how was it possible? However, Li Tianlan was not angry at what Qin Dongqiao had done. This was the attitude that a patriarch of a wealthy family should have. Friendship was friendship, but business was business. Li Tianlan suddenly had a mischievous idea. Qin Dongqiao wanted 70% of the shares. Li Tianlan simply wanted to be more outrageous. He wanted to say that he would only be given 10%. That was what he thought. Just as he was about to speak, the door of the living room was pushed open from the outside. A somewhat familiar voice sounded outside. Does he live here? I don't think so. We should consider investing in Reki City. This chapter is not over. Please turn the page. A hotel. Qin Dongqiao and Li Tianlan looked at each other, and looked back at the same time. In their sight, Dongqing Rushi came in with a man and a woman. They looked like a father and a daughter. Walking in the front was a thin middle-aged man. He looked around with his hands behind his back, and his eyes were deep and calm. Qin Dongchao's face was gloomy. His heart also sank slightly. The middle-aged man nodded to Qin Dongchao as a greeting, and then looked at Li Tianlan with a smile. "What are you talking about? What are you doing here?" Before Li Tianlan could speak, Qin Dongchao had already asked coldly. The middle-aged man was stunned, and then he couldn't help laughing. "What do you mean, old Qin? You know that there is business here. I'm not stupid. How can I not know?" Li Tianlan looked at the middle-aged man who came in, and his eyes lit up slightly. Then he looked at Qin Dongchao and saw a touch of helplessness and embarrassment in his eyes. "Old Han is here. Sit down. Ah, Xinyan, sit down too. Rushi, go make tea." Li Tianlan stood up, full of enthusiasm. Not to mention Qin Dongchao. Even if this father and daughter faced all the economic giants, in terms of wealth, they could not be at a disadvantage. Han Donglu, the boss of the Flourishing Age Fund in Zhongzhou State, and his daughter Han Xinyan. Li Tianlan and Han Donglu were not familiar with each other, but he called Han Donglu and Xinyan very naturally, which showed that they were very familiar with each other. Han Xinyan's body trembled slightly. In a trance, she seemed to see Li Tianlan raising the butcher's knife and slaughtering the entire Qin clan. Han Donglu sat down on the sofa and looked at Qin Dongchao, whose face was gloomy. Then he smiled and said, "It seems that I came at the wrong time." Qin Dongchao snorted coldly and said nothing with a sullen face. It was not his fault that he had no tolerance. The Flourishing Age Fund had just swept Eastern Europe more than a month ago. At that time, it was the time when the chaos of the Dark World swept toward Eastern Europe. An oligarch family in Snow Country was destroyed. In an instant, all financial funds were like sharks that smelled blood. The Flourishing Age Fund cooperated with the Wang family of Beihai as soon as possible, and a large amount of funds rushed into Eastern Europe. On the same day, financial giants all over the world heard the news, and the unimaginably strong funds instantly broke the financial order of Eastern Europe. Eastern European currencies rose and fell. In just a few days, the Flourishing Age Fund had taken away a lot of wealth from Eastern Europe, and part of this wealth must belong to the Qin clan. The Flourishing Age Fund had grown to the extent that everyone hated it but also feared it. Many people hoped to cooperate with the Flourishing Age Fund to plunder the wealth of other countries, but they were also wary of the Flourishing Age Fund attacking them, as if they were facing a formidable enemy. Such a notorious financial fund, wherever its boss appeared, as long as it was not for cooperation, he would most likely be boycotted by all the wealthy patriarchs in the country. "You came at the right time." Li Tianlan suddenly laughed. "Old Han, I recently have more core shares of some Eastern European families, such as the Collin family. I was just talking to Mr. Qin about this issue. He intends to give me 30% more funds and take away 70% of the shares of the Collin family that belong to me. We are still talking about it." Qin Dongchao glanced at Li Tianlan expressionlessly. Li Tianlan smiled brightly. Qin Dongchao smiled bitterly in his heart and did not speak. Give him 30% more. But 70% of the shares? Han Donglu glanced at Qin Dongchao and said with a smile, "The surname of the Qin clan shouldn't be Qin. It should be He." Qin Dongchao was furious and said with a black face, "What do you mean? I brought the most professional analysis team of the Qin clan. Come on, as if everyone has a few analysis teams. When it comes to this kind of team, our Flourishing Age Fund can be said to be the top." Han Donglu smiled. "The Collin family?" He thought for a moment. The one in the military industry in Reki City? It just so happens that I'm also interested in this family. Tianlan, why don't you listen to my offer?" Han Donglu said with a smile. Li Tianlan nodded and did not say anything. "Well, I'll pay the same amount as old Qin. As for the shares," Han Donglu looked at Li Tianlan. There was a flash of complexity in his eyes. He said, "I want 10%. How about it?" Puff. Li Tianlan sprayed the tea he had just drunk onto Qin Dongchao. Qin Dongchao seemed to be unaware of it. He was stunned for a while before he suddenly stood up and said, "Are you F***king crazy?" "That's it." Han Donglu waved his hand lightly. I've prepared the contract. I can sign it at any time. End of this chapter. Bookmark for easier reading. Chapter 565. For a moment, Qin Dongqiao even thought that the current situation was a trap set up by Li Tianlan and Han Donglu. They offered the same amount of money to buy 10% of the Colin family's shares. And this 10% was not 10% of the entire Colin family, but 10% given by the Colin family to Li Tianlan. In the Lin clan's estimation, the Colin family could at most give Li Tianlan 30% of the shares. 10% of the 30% was 3%. They used nearly 20 billion to buy this 3%. With their assets at this level, such an acquisition was no longer a question of value. Even if the 3% of the Colin family was really worth it, no one would buy it. A huge amount of money was thrown into it, and what they could get back was just some dispensable dividends. What was the use of this 3% for a small shareholder, who didn't even have the daily decision-making power of the Colin family? No matter where this money was placed, it could generate more than this amount of income. But when Han Xinyan really took out the contract from the briefcase and handed the pen and paper to Li Tianlan, Qin Dongqiao really realized how outrageous everything in front of him was. The contract was printed with the seal of the Flourishing Age Fund and Han Donglu's signature. That was to say, as long as Li Tianlan signed his name with the pen, the contract would take effect immediately, and the deal would be over. How could this be? How could this be? Qin Dongqiao's mouth kept trembling. As the boss of the Flourishing Age Fund, did he really have so much money that he didn't know how to spend it? This is 20 billion. Not 200 yuan. Even Li Tianlan was a little stunned. He subconsciously took the pen and paper handed over by Han Xinyan. For a moment, he was a little hesitant, not knowing whether he should sign or not. He wanted to tell Qin Dongqiao 10% of the shares before, but that was the attitude of the other party asking for a sky-high price. In fact, this 10% was as outrageous as the 70% that Qin Dongqiao wanted. If he took a step back, there would be room everywhere. However, Han Donglu directly set the shares at 10%. Is he really crazy? Is it fun to throw money like this? Han Donglu, we are sitting here talking about business. Do you have to make things difficult for me? Qin Dongqiao took a few deep breaths. This chapter is not over. Please turn the page. His tone became calm again. I'm happy to spend some money to disgust you, Han Donglu said with a smile. Qin Dongqiao's eyes sharpened. When he was about to speak, Han Donglu waved his hand and said, Well, I can't spend money casually. Everyone is the same. But Qin, you are really stingy. I said 10% of the shares of the Colin family is 10%, and I mean 10%. This is the sincerity of the shares of the Colin family. I mean 10% of the shares of the Colin family. This is the sincerity of the shares of the Colin. Li Tianlan glanced at Han Donglu with doubts in his eyes. And then he said with Han Li he smiled and said, Qin is. And Qin. The Lu he didn't Qin Tianli. He Donglu. Qin Dongqiao felt a little helpless. He was the first to talk to Li Tianlan about cooperation. He just wanted to get some benefits. In business, he would not refuse to get more from Li Tianlan. He knew that 70% was a little outrageous, but the lowest expectation in his heart was about 30%. Moreover, Qin Dongqiao was confident that if there was no accident, this price could be negotiated. But the accident happened. The Flourishing Age Fund, which could no longer be described as rich, intervened and became a sucker to show its so-called sincerity. In this way, if Qin Dongqiao wanted to offer a high price, Li Tianlan would sign unless he was a fool. Mr. Qin, the Colin family doesn't care how many shareholders it has. With the Flourishing Age Fund, the Qin family can also have the Colin family. I can transfer part of the shares the Colin family sold to me. If you are interested, we can talk about it. Li Tianlan said with a smile, but he was a little excited. Almost no one knew that he had taken the first step in taking root in Eastern Europe, which started when he just signed his name on the contract. He exchanged 1% of the shares of the Colin family for 20 billion yuan. With the support of the Flourishing Age Fund, Li Tianlan could use the money to buy the core business of other families. What Li Tianlan held in his hand was the core bargaining chip of the whole of Eastern Europe. If he showed a little bit, there would be many people who were willing to buy it at a high price. Li Tianlan's wealth would increase, and so would his assets. The entire East Emperor Palace was completely on the right track in this uneventful morning. Qin, this chapter is not over. Please turn the page. Dongqiao was silent for a while, then nodded and said, "The Qin family will also show enough sincerity. I want 10% of the shares of the Colin family, held by your highness. As for the price, it's the same as Han Dongluo's." Okay. Li Tianlan nodded, asked Dongqing Rushi to take a document, and put it in front of Han Donglu and Qin Dongqiao. "This is the letter of intent of each family, including the number of shares they are willing to sell to me and the price. I believe this is only the first one. There should be new families joining in later. You too can choose something you are interested in. As for the price, I won't let you suffer a loss, but I won't suffer a loss myself. There's no need to read it." Han Donglu pushed the document to Qin Dongqiao, looked at Li Tianlan, and said with a smile, "The Flourishing Age Fund wants a share of these businesses. I brought the professional team of the Flourishing Age Fund this time. You will receive the offer from the Flourishing Age Fund before tonight." Qin Dongqiao's eyes twitched. He glanced at Han Donglu and said sarcastically, "The Flourishing Age Fund is indeed the leading financial giant, but there are many industries in it. Han Donglu, aren't you afraid of choking to death?" "Industries?" Han Donglu glanced at Qin Dongqiao. For some reason, the patriarch of the Qin clan suddenly felt that the eyes of the financial giant in front of him became extremely strange for a moment. Then he shook his head with a smile and said softly, "How can this be an industry? This is the whole of Eastern Europe. The business of the Flourishing Age Fund will expand to Eastern Europe recently, so I can buy as many of these things as Tianlan has. Money is not a problem." Li Tianlan laughed. His attitude was actually the same as Han Dongluo's. When he was in control of Eastern Europe, he could have as many partners as Han Donglu. Projects and shares were not a problem. In the face of this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, his ambition had been burning uncontrollably. He wanted to build a real empire based on Eastern Europe. The more people joined this feast, the more partners he would have, and the more stable the empire would be. Today was only the first day, but the Flourishing Age Fund and the Qin clan had joined in, and become the giant pillars that could support his entire empire as stable as a rock. After the chaos in Eastern Europe, the new era had not yet arrived. But the empire belonging to Li Tianlan had already taken shape. End of this chapter. Bookmark for easy reading. Chapter 566. Everything was as Qin Dongqiao and Han Donglu had expected. Just after noon, the number of people visiting Li Tianlan suddenly increased. The patriarchs of the wealthy and powerful families in various fields in Eastern Europe seemed to have made an appointment. They came one by one. For most of the afternoon, Li Tianlan was busy entertaining guests. No matter how arrogant Li Tianlan was, he would not neglect those who gave him money and power. These were the real distinguished guests, so his smile was always warm, kind, and extremely gentle. The people who came to visit at this time naturally knew the rules. Although they wanted to communicate with Li Tianlan more, they also knew that if they did not leave, they would not only offend those who were waiting to see Li Tianlan, but also offend Li Tianlan. Therefore, the patriarchs of the wealthy and powerful families were extremely happy. After putting the letter of intent in front of Li Tianlan, they went straight to the point. For Li Tianlan and the patriarchs of the wealthy and powerful families, cooperation was very necessary and irresistible. With this premise, it was easy and pleasant to talk about business. Although such cooperation was not finalized in a few words, the one who took the longest time only sat in front of Li Tianlan for less than 30 minutes. What surprised the patriarchs of the wealthy and powerful families the most was Li Tianlan's generosity. What each family brought this time was their core business. The number of shares they were willing to sell to Li Tianlan showed their sincerity. Naturally, no one was willing to give more, but no one dared to give less. Before they came, they were even prepared to be lowered by Li Tianlan. This was a very normal thing, but the most abnormal thing was that no matter how much they offered, Li Tianlan agreed without hesitation and stated that the funds would be in place in the near future. No matter what level the business was at, such a straightforward man was rare. When the patriarchs of the wealthy and powerful families left, they were satisfied and had great expectations for future cooperation. The continuous reception officially ended at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. It was still raining in Reki City, and the sky was gradually dimming. The light was on in the study. Li Tianlan held a letter of intent and looked at it carefully. In front of him, there was a thick pile of letters of intent from each family. Li Tianlan looked at the letter of intent in front of him. His eyes filled with satisfaction. He didn't care about the price at all. Anyway, he had no money. No matter how much the other party offered, he couldn't afford it. However, with this letter of intent in his hand, a large number of people couldn't wait to pay for him. In this way, lowering the price became meaningless. What Li Tianlan needed to do was very simple. Sign, take the money, pay, and then sit back and wait for the money. It was a pleasure working with you. It seems that people from Zhongzhou State should be transferred here to deal with these things. Li Tianlan put the letter of intent aside and sighed with emotion. Tribulation was in charge of the Snowdance Corps, so there was no need to worry. But he couldn't count on the iron-blooded soldiers of the Snowdance Corps for the cooperation at present. It involved dozens of wealthy families and countless core businesses, and the funds involved were unimaginable. In this kind of cooperation, both the investment and the income every day were enough to drive people crazy. Li Tianlan knew himself well. At least he couldn't handle these businesses with ease. Moreover, among the people he knew, there didn't seem to be any talent in this field. Except for Qin Weibai. Li Tianlan was silent for a while. I'll call my family and ask them to send someone over. Dongqing Rushi, who was accompanying Li Tianlan, said. Li Tianlan was stunned. Dongqing Rushi misunderstood him and said, "Don't you trust us?" "No, it's just that I didn't expect the Dongqing clan to have such a talent. Even if there is, it won't be easy to transfer them over, will it?" Li Tianlan laughed. "I'll figure it out." Dongqing Rushi was full of confidence. She paused and continued. "Han Xinyan can also help. You tell Han Donglu, and he will agree." Li Tianlan nodded. It was such a big cooperation. No matter how ambitious Han Donglu was, he couldn't let go completely. If Han Xinyan stayed, she could not only help but also reassure the Flourishing Age Fund. Li Tianlan reached out and pinched Dongqing Rushi's nose. When he was about to speak, the phone suddenly rang. It was Qin Weibai's phone call. Li Tianlan picked up the phone and said with a chuckle, "You're up?" On the other side of the phone, Qin Weibai. "This chapter is not over. Please turn the page." After a pause, she snorted with dissatisfaction and said with hatred, "You're not satisfied that I'm not tortured to death by you, are you?" Li Tianlan laughed, and his eyes inadvertently met Dongqing Rushi's. Dongqing Rushi's eyes were clear, and her face was innocent. Li Tianlan subconsciously stopped smiling and coughed. "Where are you?" Qin Weibai asked softly. "Still in the hotel." Li Tianlan patted the letter of intent beside him and said, "I dealt with some things." Qin Weibai was silent for a few seconds, and then said softly, "I'm leaving." Li Tianlan paused and looked up at his watch. "Mormons?" "Yes." "I'll see you off." Li Tianlan stood up without hesitation and hung up the phone directly. "Wait for me." Dongqing Rushi stood up and took a coat from the hanger. Li Tianlan hesitated, held her hand and said, "Little Bai is here, but she's leaving soon. Come with me to see her off." "Ah, sister?" Dongqing Rushi said and looked at Li Tianlan. "Were you with my sister last night?" There was no jealousy in her tone, only curiosity. But for some reason, Li Tianlan suddenly felt a little guilty. He said vaguely, found a coat for Dongqing Rushi, and put it on. "Let's go. I'll find someone to prepare the car." Because the distance between the two hotels was not far, it took Li Tianlan only 10 minutes to get to the hotel where Qin Weibai was. In the hotel room, Master of Samsara Palace was still sitting in front of the windowsill, looking at the wind and rain outside. Flaming Fire was sitting in the living room and drinking tea. The sound of a hairdryer was heard in the bathroom. Qin Weibai, in a white bathrobe, had just taken a shower. Her hair was wet, and she was standing in front of the mirror to dry her hair. Seeing him come in, Master of Samsara Palace turned around and nodded as a greeting. Flaming Fire didn't even raise her head. Li Tianlong glanced at her and ignored her. He just looked at Qin Weibai standing in front of the mirror and said, "Why are you in such a hurry?" "Something came up, and I have to deal with it." Qin Weibai sighed softly. She had promised Li Tianlong to attend the dinner tonight. She put down the hairdryer and walked out, sounding a little regretful. "Sister." Dongqing Rushi stood beside Li Tianlong and called. Qin Weibai was stunned for a moment, then smiled and touched Rushi's hair, saying softly, "Come in and sit down. Let me introduce you." Qin Weibai walked into the living room with Dongqing Rushi and said softly, "This is Dongqing Rushi." Master of Samsara Palace interrupted Qin Weibai. She glanced at Qin Weibai with calm eyes. "I know her." Qin Weibai was silent for a moment, then nodded and said to Dongqing Rushi, "This is my sister, Master of Samsara Palace." Dongqing Rushi didn't ask Master of Samsara Palace what her name was. Instead, she bowed seriously and said, "Greetings, Your Highness." Master of Samsara Palace glanced at her, and her eyes were a little intimate. At that moment, he didn't know whether it was an illusion or something else, but he seemed to vaguely see guilt in this touch of intimacy. He didn't know whether it was an illusion or a real emotion, but the Master of Samsara Palace regained her indifference. She looked at Li Tianlong and asked, "Is Eastern Europe very lively today?" Li Tianlong answered, "Yes, mainly because my place is more lively." "I heard about it." Master of Samsara Palace said slowly, "Since all the big families want to be with you, this is a good opportunity. What's your plan?" "It's hard to say at the moment." Li Tianlong shook his head. "This is indeed a good opportunity, but the business is too big, and many things are not easy to deal with. After returning home, I will arrange for people in this field to do business, to do big business, to the extent that it concerns the lifelines of several countries. I can't deal with it for the time being. If the Dongqing clan has talents in this field, they can borrow them first. Let me recommend 2 people to you." Master of Samsara Palace said. Li Tianlong took a deep look at her and asked, "Are they from Samsara Palace?" "No." Master of Samsara Palace shook her head. "This chapter is not over. Please turn the page. When you were in a coma, there was a rumor in Reki City. It's very popular." Li Tianlong was a little confused. "The rumor is that the Qin clan intends to unite with you by marriage and betroth Qin Qingyao, the eldest miss of the Qin clan, to you." Master of Samsara Palace said. Li Tianlong touched his nose subconsciously, shook his head and said, "Ridiculous." Of course, he had heard of this rumor, but he had never taken it seriously. He said, "It's true." Master of Samsara Palace said, "Qin Dongqiao did have this idea. He even sent Qin Weiyin to test you, but was stopped by Qin Shilai. But for now, this is only temporary. As your business gets bigger and bigger, this idea will emerge from the Qin clan sooner or later. In this case, it's better to take the initiative to ask the Qin clan for Qin Qingyao. To come over?" Li Tianlong frowned. "I want to work for you, be your woman, and do anything." Master of Samsara Palace said lightly, "Don't worry, the Qin clan has no reason to refuse, and Qin Qingyao will not refuse. You don't even have to promise anything. As long as you ask, Qin Qingyao will appear in front of you immediately." Li Tianlong subconsciously glanced at Qin Weibai. Qin Weibai narrowed her eyes, looking like a sulking cat. She didn't speak, nor did Dongqing Rushi. "If you don't want to ask about this, I can help you. In business, Qin Qingyao is very useful, and very useful. As for the other one, it's Han Xinyan. If you want Han Xinyan, you have to go to Han Donglu yourself. But Han Donglu won't refuse." Master of Samsara Palace suddenly smiled. "If you're willing, it's best to put Rushi in Eastern Europe. This girl looks silly, but when it comes to doing things, she's no worse than anyone else. The Qin clan and the Flourishing Age Fund are the 2 pillars that support your foundation. If you ask the young ladies of these 2 forces to come over, Rushi is fully capable of balancing the relationship between them." Li Tianlong frowned. Before he spoke, Master of Samsara Palace had already waved to Dongqing Rushi. Come here. Dongqing Rushi hesitated and walked to Master of Samsara Palace. Master of Samsara Palace stood up, reached out, and gently touched Dongqing Rushi's head. Dongqing Rushi looked at her with her eyes wide open, a little confused. Since you're here today, how about I help you once? Master of Samsara Palace looked into Dongqing Rushi's eyes and asked. At that moment, the whole world seemed to become distorted and blurred. The messy wind and rain whistled and gathered in front of them. The raindrops were messy and cold. Heaven and earth were changing color, and everything was pale. The vast snow covered the city without warning. The tall buildings turned into mountains. The lone peak stood tall, and the world was vast. Dongqing Rushi's eyes were dazed and dull. Li Tianlan clearly saw that she took a step back with one foot, but her other foot was moving forward. Master of Samsara Palace's hand that fell on her head began to shine. It was colorful, and the sword intent soared into the sky. Dongqing Rushi stared at the sword light blankly. She retracted her foot that had stepped back. Master of Samsara Palace's palm fell. Dongqing Rushi suddenly opened her mouth. She didn't make a sound. But in that instant, everyone heard a silent and mournful scream. Puff. Dongqing Rushi spat out a mouthful of blood. Li Tianlan's face changed dramatically. He walked over and held Dongqing Rushi in his arms. He turned to look at Master of Samsara Palace, and his eyes suddenly became deep and calm. It's for her own good. Master of Samsara Palace took a step back, and her tone was a little tired. Li Tianlan took a deep breath, looked at Dongqing Rushi in his arms, and said in a deep voice, "How are you?" Dongqing Rushi blinked her blank eyes, and they became moist again. At that moment, the spiritual energy in her body seemed to be completely alive, and she became extremely agile. She even sounded a little happy. "I'm fine." As if she had broken free from some shackles. Her voice was clear, cheerful, and extremely delicate. End of this chapter. Bookmark for easier reading. Chapter 567. Li Tianlan looked at Dongqing Rushi seriously. The scene in front of him seemed to be beyond his understanding, but vaguely he seemed to catch something. It was so vague that he was at a loss. After vomiting blood, Dongqing Rushi's breath was still stable. She seemed to have no injury, but her spirit became a little sluggish after the initial excitement. She leaned in Li Tianlan's arms, reached out her hand, and grabbed his ear. She murmured, "I'm so sleepy. I want to sleep." "Go to my room," Qin Weibai said softly. "It's open until tomorrow. She can have a good sleep." Li Tianlan glanced at Qin Weibai, nodded, and carried Dongqing Rushi. Her room was open until tomorrow. Did it mean that she had known that Dongqing Rushi would come? She had prepared for everything in front of her. He carried Dongqing Rushi to Qin Weibai's room. When he put her on the bed, Dongqing Rushi, who couldn't open her eyes, had fallen asleep. Li Tianlan looked at Dongqing Rushi, who was sleeping sweetly on the bed, and was silent for a long time. He could feel that Dongqing Rushi wasn't hurt, but he could also feel her weakness. That kind of weakness wasn't because of her body, but because of the exhaustion of her willpower. As a result, Dongqing Rushi's realm directly regressed 1,000 miles. Perhaps no one had noticed that there was a genius among the younger generation of Zhongzhou state. That was Dongqing Rushi. She had been very close to the half-step invincible realm, but she looked too soft beside Li Tianlan, so people always subconsciously ignored her. But her previous realm had always been there. If they really fought against each other, no one dared to underestimate her. But now, in the blink of an eye, Dongqing Rushi's realm had slipped from the half-step invincible realm to the peak of the thundershocking realm, and then her breath became stable again. Li Tianlan slowly turned his head. Qin Weibai stood quietly beside him, also looking at Dongqing Rushi, who was sleeping. Her eyes were a little complicated, and she was in a trance. "What the hell is going on?" Li Tianlan asked, and his voice was calm. "This is indeed for her own good. No one wants to harm her, but in her current state, there is no good opportunity, and no one can help her. When she is by your side, her heart is the most relaxed. And it is also the time when her instincts are the most relaxed. Moreover, during this period of time, Her condition is very good. So sister took the risk to help. Qin Weibai paused and continued. The result is not perfect, but it's not bad. Li Tianlan nodded and said directly, I don't understand. Qin Weibai hesitated and said softly, Rushi Tianlan. Li Tianlan took a deep breath. He didn't want to lose his temper with Qin Weibai, but now he was really a little annoyed. First, it was because Dongqing Rushi's realm had regressed. Second, it was because of the negative emotions brought about by things that were beyond his control. He, who had become more and more used to controlling everything, especially disliked this feeling. He took out a cigarette, lit it, and took a deep puff. Her mental state is extremely poor now. Her injuries are not only physical, but sometimes mental injuries are even more serious. Her mental strength is at most half of her normal state. That's half. Qin Weibai said. Rushi's normal state has always been abnormal. Now she is really normal. She looked at Li Tianlan with gentle eyes and said quietly, Have you forgotten Dongqing Yueshin? It was as if someone had poured a bucket of cold water on his head in the dead of winter. Li Tianlan's body shuddered violently, and he could no longer speak. He had indeed forgotten. From Zhongzhou State to Eastern Europe, and then he and Dongqing Rushi were lying in the same bed. Li Tianlan couldn't remember how long it had been since he last saw Dongqing Yueshin's personality. In front of him, it had always been Dongqing Rushi, lively, obedient, well-behaved and charming. The sharp personality that belonged to Dongqing Yueshin had never appeared from beginning to end. Rushi has two personalities. Dongqing Yueshin's personality is very independent, and she is also very aggressive. Silly Tianlan, that personality is not like this. She may not have any good intentions towards you. Just now, when my sister attacked, she directly crushed Dongqing Yueshin in the spiritual field, and severely injured her personality in an instant. Although that personality has not completely disappeared, it is destined not to appear for a long time. Without the support of this personality, Rushi will naturally be weak. But now Rushi is simply her. At this moment, Li Tianlan suddenly thought of a scene from a long time ago. It was the final battle of Heaven Capital more than 3 years ago. Before the final battle, on the night when they were investigating in Changdao, Dongqing Rushi's blade was indeed very close to his body at a certain moment. But it was stopped by Du Hanin that time. After such a long time, Li Tianlan had long understood that it was Dongqing Yueshin who pretended to be Dongqing Rushi's personality at that time. If Du Hanin hadn't taken action in time, it was hard to say what would have happened to Li Tianlan, who was completely defenseless against Dongqing Yueshin. Li Tianlan rubbed his forehead and asked, Why did Dongqing Yueshin want to kill me? Who knows? Qin Weibai's tone was a little cold, but it was not aimed at Li Tianlan. It's not surprising that this kind of distorted personality can do anything. Now, although my sister has hurt her badly, she hasn't completely destroyed her. Sooner or later, she will appear again. We have to find a chance to make her disappear completely. Li Tianlan smoked for a long time and then said slowly, I'll pay attention. Qin Weibai said no more. She took Li Tianlan's palm and said softly, It's safe here. Let her sleep. Let's go next door. I have something to give you. Li Tianlan silently turned around and closed the door. In the suite next door, Flaming Fire was not drinking tea. The master of Samsara Palace had stood up and was ready to leave at any time. Li Tianlan looked at her back, and his heart became more and more complicated. He took the initiative to say, If there's anything I can help Mormons with, just tell me. I'll do my best. Even those who didn't know about the dark world could understand the power of doing his best at this time. That was all the overt and covert forces of the Snowdance Corps, countless wealthy families in Eastern Europe, and even the entire giant group of Zhongzhou State, Sai City, and the Li family. This was Li Tianlan's full effort. No need. The master of Samsara Palace turned to look at Li Tianlan. After a long time, she shook her head and said, I can handle it. After a pause, she continued, Besides, it's my battlefield. Li Tianlan shook his head and said blandly, In my opinion, there's no need for this so-called battlefield to exist. It doesn't make sense to say this. The master of Samsara Palace laughed. Everything has started. It's too late. It's too late to say anything. The sky was completely dark. The strong wind and heavy rain fell from behind her. All the stories, in this era, and all the grievances should be put to an end by someone. The master of Samsara Palace said softly, "The former chosen one will become a thing of the past, and the new chosen one has risen. Do you remember what I said? Don't let yourself down in anything in the world. Don't let yourself down and don't let him down. I once ended the era of the chosen one. Now I'm opening a new era for the new chosen one." The master of Samsara Palace's smile was light and emotionless. My whole life." Her voice gradually deepened. "My whole life." There seemed to be a huge weight stuck in Li Tianlan's throat. He stared at the master of Samsara Palace in a daze and couldn't say a word. The master of Samsara Palace took a deep breath and took a notebook with a blue cover. She said softly, "This is for you." Li Tianlan took it and glanced at Qin Weibai subconsciously. The notebook in his hand was extremely old. It seemed to be the one that Qin Weibai had held before. Whether the content was the same or not, at least it was the same from the outside. This is, standing in the supreme realm of the Chosen One, his understanding of the Li family's swordsmanship, the Wang family of Beihai's swordsmanship, and the 10 skills of true martial arts of Kunlun City. The master of Samsara Palace said slowly, "This is the martial arts belonging to the supreme realm." He killed many enemies in his life. He recorded all the martial arts that caught his eye. He also recorded his own evaluation, understanding and coping methods, as well as his own way of using power and unique skills. These are the thoughts of the Chosen One. You can use them as a reference. Just take a look. Li Tianlan's heart suddenly trembled. He flipped through the notebook with a blank mind. The 6 paths of reincarnation sword. The 24 moves of sword. The 10th unique domain. The 30-meter mortal world. The glory of the holy hall. The shadow world. Reigning sword with Jifeng. Countless unique skills that shocked the dark world flowed on the paper one by one. Li Tianlan couldn't describe his feelings. If the dark world was a bigger Jianghu, then the thing in his hand was the so-called secret book that could make all the people in Jianghu crazy. This gift could be said to be extremely heavy, so heavy that even his fingers were trembling. Li Tianlan opened his mouth. "Don't refuse." The master of Samsara Palace said slowly, "This should belong to you. It should have been given to you." Li Tianlan's expression was complicated. He still didn't know what his relationship with Dongcheng Huangtu was. But the existence of the Chosen One was no longer illusory. The blue notebook in his hand was the most important evidence. The real Great Way was in his hand. Deity of the Purgatory of Heaven Capital knew that he had no hope of becoming the Chosen One. So he took another path of the 24 moves of sword. He abandoned the illusory and pursued the ultimate reality. The master of Samsara Palace said softly, "In a sense, I'm the same as him. I can also see the path of the Chosen One, but I can't control his day and night. So I only took one side and reached the present realm. But you're different. I hope you can follow the path he took and finally embark on a path that really belongs to you." Li Tianlan held the notebook and pondered for a long time. Then he said blandly, "Day and night, reality and illusion." The master of Samsara Palace nodded. "It's perfect." Li Tianlan laughed. He looked into the eyes of the master of Samsara Palace and said with expectation and uneasiness that he didn't even notice, "You must live. You must live." The master of Samsara Palace took a deep look at him. His light voice seemed to come from far away, carrying with it countless emotions that seemed somewhat unfathomable because of the distance, like dark clouds drifting across the sky. "I'm leaving," she said. Chapter 568. Snow Country Mormons. Tian-Yin walked out of the ancient small castle expressionlessly. Facing the heavy rain, he did not look back. Deity looked at his back quietly, and his aura became more and more real. Since about half a year ago, every time the two met, they parted on bad terms. They had saved each other's lives more than once. They had gone through thick and thin together and fought side by side, but neither of them could persuade each other. With Tian-Yin as the leader, the cracks in the entire purgatory of Heaven Capital seemed to have become more and more obvious. Deity never sighed with emotion or wavered, just like his eyes when he looked at Tian Yin's back at this moment. Apart from calmness, there was only stubbornness in his eyes. The wind and rain were like knives. Tian Yin did not evaporate the rain around him. He walked against the heavy rain and wiped the rain off his face. It was cold and rainy in Eastern Europe, and the polar night was still the same. In the cold and dark environment, his eyes were as bright as cold stars, and he looked more and more indifferent. Daybreak, dressed in white, looked at Tian Yin in front of the castle with a complicated look in his eyes. Tian Yin nodded to him, but his footsteps did not stop. "How is it?" Daybreak took the initiative to ask. Tian Yin paused and said hoarsely, "After the final battle, I will go to Tiannan." In his several conversations with deity, this was the final result. Tian Yin was very satisfied with this result, but he definitely did not like it. He did not like this result, not at all. "Why do you have to do this?" Daybreak sighed softly. "Yes. Why do you have to do this?" Tian Yin repeated and shook his head. He walked into the wind and rain, and the two passed each other. "That's for the best." "Did you think about me when you went to Tiannan?" Daybreak suddenly asked. His tone was very slow, almost enunciating each word, with indescribable weight. Tian Yin's steps forward suddenly stopped. He stood in the rain. The wind and rain, like knives, instantly wet his whole body. After a long time, Tian Yin said slowly, "You and I have been friends for many years. I want you to tell me the truth. Do you think His Highness did the right thing?" Daybreak had nothing to say. He shook his head. "I will not question any decision made by His Highness. Not questioning doesn't mean he is right." Tian Yin said faintly, "Wrong is wrong. For so many years, the Li family has been holed up in the border, and people have been coming out from there to go to the purgatory of heaven capital. But has your highness ever gone back once? Have you ever gone back even once? None of you know the life there. The Li family has suffered for so many years and been in despair for so many years. Everyone regards the young master as the Li family's future hope, a little hope squeezed out of despair. Now that I have come to the purgatory of heaven capital, he told me that the young master is not worthy, and you also think that the young master is not worthy. Ha, not worthy? The Li family has placed all its hopes on the young master for so many years. Your King telling me that he doesn't deserve it? Why? Who do you think you are? What right does he have? What right do you have to say that I'm not worthy? Are you worthy? Simply preposterous. His voice was getting louder and louder. In the wind and rain, he stood in front of Daybreak, almost roaring to vent his long-suppressed emotions. Daybreak said nothing. He did not need to answer that question. Tian Yin's every question was directed at His Highness. He was asking if His Highness was worthy. Did he deserve to deny Li Tianlan? Deity in the castle did not answer. He was quiet. Tian Yin waited for a while and smiled self-mockingly. I will participate in this decisive battle, which can be regarded as an end to my days in the purgatory of heaven capital. But I am just the beginning. More and more people will leave here and the purgatory of heaven capital. I have no problem with him claiming to be deity. I have no problem with him saying that the young master doesn't deserve it. But in my eyes he doesn't deserve it either. The purgatory of heaven capital doesn't deserve it. The wind and rain were absent-minded and cold. Through the rain, Tian Yin looked at Daybreak in front of him and said in a cold and gloomy tone, "From today on, in my heart, the purgatory of heaven capital is the purgatory of heaven capital. And the Li family is the Li family. I will return to Tiannan. As for you and me, if I don't die this time, we will meet in Tiannan." Without saying more, he turned around and walked straight into the rain. Standing in the same place, Daybreak's eyes finally showed a touch of bitterness, even pain. Everyone in the purgatory of heaven capital knew that he was in charge of everything in Tiannan. And even the entire Sanluo Hall was there. Tian Yin went to Tiannan and stood beside the so-called young master. If they met in Tiannan in the future, what would it be like? What would be the position of the two of them? It was better not to see them. Daybreak took a deep breath. They were brothers who had gone through thick and thin with him. But from today on, what were they? I will break through to the invincible realm in the near future. It's better not to see each other in the future. Daybreak's deep voice sounded and fell into Tianyin's ears from all directions. He was the second expert in the purgatory of Heaven Capital, except for deity. He had the real combat capability of the invincible realm. With the murderous weapon Shadow the Ripper in his hand, once he broke through, the strength of the entire purgatory of Heaven Capital would greatly increase. Tianyin's footsteps paused, but he did not stop. In the Dark World, there were very few experts who broke through to the invincible realm after the age of 40. For martial arts, 40 years old was a person's peak period, but it was also the period when one began to go downhill from the peak. But nothing was absolute. There were very few such people, but it didn't mean that there were none. After all, deity had made the achievements he had today even though his foundation was almost completely destroyed after the War of Treason. Daybreak stood where he was and watched Tianyin's back disappear. He didn't move for a long time. "Come in." Deity's voice sounded in his ear. Daybreak silently turned around and walked into the castle. Deity stood alone in the hall of the castle, admiring a medieval armor placed in the hall. Hearing Daybreak's footsteps, he shook his head slightly. "It's useless," he said. "We all know him very well. We were able to walk together because we were like-minded. Now we have different paths and can't work together. Let him go." "Do you think Tianyin is wrong?" Daybreak asked after a moment of silence. "Wrong?" Deity smiled. "We are not children anymore. How can there be right or wrong in everything in the world? There is no right or wrong in the world, but we do." Daybreak's voice trembled a little. "We are on the same side." Deity was silent for a moment and said blandly, "We used to be, but not anymore." He stretched out his hand and flicked the armor in front of him. The crisp sound of the collision spread throughout the castle, like the sound of a sword. "Don't think too much." Deity turned around and looked at Daybreak. "Business is more important. At present, there are more than 500 elites gathered in Mormons." Daybreak took a deep breath and forced himself to calm down. "We are all on the same side and can be completely trusted." "Very good." Deity nodded. "Everyone be on standby." Daybreak nodded. He hesitated for a moment and suddenly asked, "We have to guard against Qin Weibai's sword." When the divine weapon of Lin An was born, Phoenix, who was nurturing her fetus in Lin An, revealed the news to deity as soon as possible. Daybreak had already felt the power of the sword just from the oral description. Such a divine weapon was simply unheard of. This chapter is not over. Please turn the page. Deity had never heard of this sword. He was silent for a moment and finally shook his head. "It's okay. We have to guard against it." Daybreak repeated his words. "Of course, but this sword can't fall on me. Qin Weibai, that woman, except for Li Tianlan, I'm afraid she doesn't care about the whole world. If that sword is in her hands, she can only deal with Wang Tianzong. Others, including me, are probably not important in her eyes." Speaking of Qin Weibai, Daybreak raised his eyebrows. "According to the intelligence, she is now in Reki City. It's almost time to come back." Deity walked to the bed and looked out of the window. The wind and rain continued. In this place where there was no sunlight for 24 hours, the darkness seemed to have become the only eternal color. The darkness, the heavy rain, everything became more and more violent, colder and more messy. Deity stared into the distance and whispered to himself, "It's about to start." The morning sun rose on Mount Dibbing. Summer Solstice, who was dressed in splendid clothes, solemnly walked out of the laboratory with a huge wooden box in her hands. In many cases, Firmament, who could represent the Wang family of Beihai in the Dark World, stood outside respectfully. As soon as Summer Solstice came out, Firmament's eyes fell on the wooden box in her hand. The huge wooden box was nearly 3 meters long and 1 meter wide. It was black and extremely heavy. Firmament's eyes suddenly became fanatical, and his body even began to tremble slightly. Summer Solstice handed the wooden box in her hand to Firmament and said calmly, "Take it to Eastern Europe and give it to Tianzong." This is Geo. Firmament's voice was messy and in a trance. "This is the coldness of 9 states." Summer Solstice whispered, "The first divine weapon in the Dark World." Firmament took a deep breath and carefully held the wooden box. For a moment he did not dare to move. You go now. Summer Solstice said calmly. The private plane is ready. Go now. I'll go too. A voice suddenly sounded, warm and peaceful. Summer Solstice raised her eyebrows and turned her head. In her sight, a slender young man walked over with his back to the morning sun. The sun shone on him. Vaguely, every pore on his body seemed to be emitting a faint fire. Summer Solstice blinked. The young man walked up to her and whispered, Mom, I'll go. Shengxiao you, Summer Solstice looked at Wang Shengxiao in a daze. For a moment, she felt that her son was a little strange. Since the final maneuver, Wang Shengxiao, who was known as the heavenly son of Beihai, had been silent on Mount Dibing. His sword strike at the cost of his realm was still easily defeated. No one knew what he had experienced in his heart after such a crushing defeat. On the day when the coldness of 9 states was cast, there was movement for the first time in the place where Wang Shengxiao was silent and meditating. It was not until today that he really came out. At this moment, Wang Shengxiao seemed to be no different from usual, but Summer Solstice always felt that there was something different about him. I'll go to Eastern Europe with Firmament. Wang Shengxiao repeated his request calmly. But you're only, Summer Solstice frowned. She wanted to say that he was only in the fire-flaming realm now, but as soon as she said it, she suddenly felt that something was wrong. Now Wang Shengxiao was indeed still in the fire-flaming realm, but the fire-flaming realm could no longer represent his current strength. In Summer Solstice's perception, the current Wang Shengxiao was completely a ball of fire. He looked gentle and calm, but he was always burning. Every flame was unimaginably hot and violent. At this moment, a word suddenly came to Summer Solstice's mind. Rebirth from the fire. How's your strength now? Summer Solstice suddenly asked. Wang Shengxiao thought about it seriously and said frankly, I'm still no match for Li Tianlan. He paused and continued, I mean Li Tianlan in the final maneuver state. Summer Solstice was silent for a moment. It was not long before the first day of the final maneuver. But now Li Tianlan was obviously stronger than he was at the beginning. You may not know yet. Summer Solstice whispered. During this time, Jiang Shangyu kept breaking the realm overnight. Now he is a superior a half step to the invincible realm. Wang Shengxiao raised his eyebrows and said, I knew he was not simple. He knew what his mother meant, so he thought about it and said, It's okay. Even if I can't beat him now, he can't beat me. He reached out his hand. A tiny flame appeared in his hand. The flame seemed weak, but it was beating very violently and endlessly. Summer Solstice's eyes lit up. That was the real emotion of amazement. Firmament's body tightened subconsciously. Looking at the flame in Wang Shengxiao's hand, his eyes were extremely solemn. Wang Shengxiao's tone was a little emotional and a little complicated. The 4 realms of martial arts have delayed me for many years. It's good that you can figure it out. Summer Solstice smiled. At this moment, it seemed that even the rising sun had dimmed a little. She took a step forward, tidied her son's collar, and whispered, Go ahead. Be careful. Wang Shengxiao nodded, hugged Summer Solstice gently, and turned around. Firmament handed the huge wooden box in his hand to Wang Shengxiao. Wang Shengxiao took it. The huge wooden box shook slightly with a happy emotion. Wang Shengxiao and Firmament went straight down the mountain and rushed to the airport at the foot of the mountain. There, the silver-gray special plane with the medal of Firmament and C engraved on the fuselage was ready. They would go directly to Eastern Europe. The whole of Eastern Europe, Wang Tianzong, and the whole Dark World. Everyone was waiting for this sword. Summer Solstice turned and walked to her residence. Among her favorite flowers and plants, there was a crystal-clear jade guanyin statue. Summer Solstice knelt in front of guanyin, put her palms together, and looked extremely pious. She closed her eyes and whispered, It's about to start. Reki City, the office of the president. Countless elites of the Snow Dance Corps quietly surrounded the area of hundreds of meters around Wang Tianzong. Tribulation stood in front of the office of the president, his eyes focused. Cool breeze and drifting cloud. Phantom Yin and Yang. Li Zhonghu, Li Wangsheng, Hua Qingfeng. High-level officials appeared behind Tribulation one by one. Everyone was looking at the room in the ruins. Under the wind and rain, the room seemed to come alive and was trembling slightly, as if it was breathing. The sword intent all over the sky whistled in the room every time it trembled, sweeping through the night and driving the wind. The raindrops were completely torn apart by the sword intent. The tiny water droplets did not fall, but hung in the sky with the sword intent. There were more and more broken raindrops, and the water droplets were densely suspended in every corner of the office of the president. The room was still trembling slightly. In everyone's sight, the room was becoming more and more blurred and distant. No one could see the room anymore. No one could see Wang Tianzong either. In the blurry world, there seemed to be something. This chapter is not over. Please turn the page. Something was happening. It was slow and firm, but unstoppable. In the room, under the dim light, Wang Tianzong was still practicing calligraphy. His handwriting was getting fewer and fewer, and it was still decreasing. I'm the first among all the ambitious and ruthless people. There were no more eternal people. The ambitious and ruthless people were also disappearing. The handwriting finally had no you and me. Only the first one was left. Wang Tianzong's movements became more and more natural. The tip of the brush in his hand wandered on the white paper. At a certain moment, he no longer seemed to be practicing calligraphy. He seemed to have no strength at all, and was as light as a feather. Only the brush, which seemed to be able to tear the whole world, was still wandering, driving his whole body and will. Sublimation. Upward. Peak. And to the peak again. In the increasingly blurred scene, an elite of the Snowdance Corps, who was guarding the outermost periphery of the square, walked in. He held a letter in his hand. He handed the envelope to the low-level officer above him. The low-level officer handed it to the middle-level officer, and the middle-level officer handed it to the high-level officer. The letter finally fell into the hands of Cool Breeze. Cool Breeze held the letter, and an ominous premonition suddenly surged up. His palm trembled subconsciously. He was not the recipient of the letter. The recipient of the letter was Tribulation. He hesitated and exchanged a look with Drifting Cloud. "What's wrong?" Tribulation's hoarse voice sounded. He turned his head. Cool Breeze subconsciously shrank his palm, then said with a wry smile, "Nothing." Tribulation's eyes fell on the letter in Cool Breeze's hand. "For me?" Tribulation asked. Cool Breeze's face darkened, and the ominous premonition in his heart grew stronger and stronger. "Give it to me." Tribulation stretched out his hand. "Your Highness." Cool Breeze opened his mouth. "Give it to me." Tribulation repeated. Cool Breeze gritted his teeth and handed the envelope in his hand to Tribulation. Tribulation looked at the envelope, narrowed his eyes, and opened it casually. In the wind and rain, a photo was pulled out of the envelope by Tribulation. Cool Breeze and Drifting Cloud looked a little confused. It was a woman in the photo. She was dressed in a white dress and had a delicate body. This was originally a woman who could be said to be devastatingly beautiful, but at this moment, half of her face was swollen. A deep scar ran from her chin all the way to her back, completely destroying the beauty of her face, and making her look incomparably hideous. Droplets of blood splattered on her white dress as she stared blankly in front of her. Desperate and helpless. Cool Breeze and Drifting Cloud didn't know this woman, nor did they know what this photo was trying to show. Tribulation lowered his head and looked at it quietly. His eyes were cold and calm, so deep that there wasn't the slightest fluctuation in them. But this photo seemed to carry an unattainable weight. It slipped from his hand and fell into the wind and rain. The back of the photo appeared in Tribulation's sight. It was a line of Chinese characters. It was crooked, but every stroke carried a strong sense of anger and domineering. "My glory is in Mormons. Heretic, come and die." Heretic. There was only one force in the world that could use this word. The Vatican. And there was only one person in the whole Vatican who was qualified and confident to let Tribulation go and die. Saint War Angel Arcis. But why did the Vatican believe that Tribulation would pass just based on this photo? Cool Breeze and Drifting Cloud frowned. Almost at the same time, they thought of a message that no one in Sai City mentioned, but everyone had heard of. White dress. White dress. Holy Virgin Angel. Cool breeze and drifting clouds' expressions changed. Your Highness. Cool breeze called tentatively. Tribulation didn't speak or move. He kept his head down and looked at the photo in the rain. His aura was disappearing. All his vitality began to converge, and finally, there was nothing left. That was the extreme of the whole person. He was desperately converging and finally became barren. Cool breeze subconsciously reached out and touched Tribulation. Your Highness. He didn't finish his words. His palm passed through Tribulation's chest. Tribulation's figure began to twist and shake. He didn't know when it stopped where he was, but a shadow. Cool breeze, whose face changed dramatically, was about to turn around. In the room, Wang Tianzong's stroke fell again. There was only one word. One. One word was like a sword. In an instant, the hazy and violent sword energy broke through the room. A circular ripple swept across the whole square in the most fierce and arrogant manner, and finally went straight into the night sky. The vast and endless sword energy was like a dragon, surging like a tide. The hazy and clear sword light was endless, and it directly broke the whole sky. Wherever his vision passed, the entire sky was shattering, and black ripples appeared one after another in the transparent space. The messy rainwater seemed to fall from countless worlds, but it was shattered by the sword intent, turning into ice crystals one after another. There were more and more ice crystals. From top to bottom, they spread out in all directions and covered the whole square in an instant. With Wang Tianzong's room as the center, countless ice crystals with sword intent continued to spread out. Cool breeze kept turning around and froze in place. Drifting cloud stretched out his palm and froze. Li Zhonghu raised his head in confusion. Hua Qingfeng was frowning. The yin and yang phantom seemed to want to take a step. Tribulation's shadow was twisting. It froze. All froze. Tens of thousands of people, the whole square, and the whole Snowdance core were completely frozen in an instant. In other words, they were directly imprisoned in place by the unimaginable majestic sword energy. The whole square was dead silent in an instant. Everyone kept the posture of that moment, motionless. Only the sword intent was still whistling between heaven and earth and kept spinning. In the room, Wang Tianzong raised his head and looked to the south. His sight seemed to cross Eastern Europe, Snow Country, the vast Beihai, and fell on Mount Dibbing. The sun was rising there. The flowers were blooming there. As the breeze passed, the birds were singing and the flowers were fragrant. There were mountains and rivers, laughter, and people lived and worked in peace and contentment. The Wang family of Beihai had lived for hundreds of years because of the glory and brilliance brought by being invincible in the world. But now at this moment, this night, the new glory was right under his feet. Wang Tianzong looked in that direction. His eyes were full of undisguised attachment and love, so heavy and affectionate. He would sweep through this era. Then he would return there, and continue to rush to the highest peak with the Wang family of Beihai. He would go back. He must go back. Wang Tianzong clenched his fists. He looked at the island and the mountain in Beihai and whispered, "Wait for me." End of this chapter. Bookmark for easier reading. Chapter 569. Under the wind and rain, Reki City was full of lights. Before the banquet in the Manlisai Hotel began, Wulan State and Zhongzhou State finally began to sign agreements one by one. Riker and Li Huaqing sat opposite each other. The hall was full of flashing cameras. Almost all the important figures in the two countries were witnessing this scene. The repeated signatures fell on different agreements. The entire Wulan State began to change quietly in the ignorance and cheers of all the people. Countless interests entered Zhongzhou State with these agreements. The world's most powerful hegemon country crushed over with undisguised toughness and sharpness. Sovereignty, reputation, freedom, hope, interests, and future. Everything began to break apart. Riker was expressionless. His palms were trembling violently, his mind was blank, and he was dizzy. He signed one name after another purely by instinct. After tonight, the former Wulan State would completely become a thing of the past. Everything in the future of this country would fall on him. He would be a sinner throughout the ages. Riker smiled absent-mindedly and signed his name on the last agreement. There was a round of applause around him, which was extremely ironic. The applause surrounded the entire training ground, and it was so lively that it was even a little absurd. The sun fell near noon. The clear and firm voice seemed to echo in everyone's ears. People clapped subconsciously, and their thoughts were in a mess. On the high platform, the enchanting and solemn short-haired woman walked down in everyone's eyes. She walked to the group of students of the Sky Academy. In an instant, almost all the students stood up and applauded desperately. The applause was fanatical. That day was the graduation ceremony of the Sky Academy. After Zhuang Huayang, the principal of the Sky Academy, and Chen Songlin, the dean of the Deep Sea Academy, respectively delivered their speeches, the representative of the East Emperor Palace, as a dark horse in the maneuver of the two academies, came to the stage and generally stated the plan of the East Emperor Palace for the next 3 years. This was the result of the East Emperor Palace's deliberate courtesy. Whether it was Zhuang Huayang of the Sky Academy or Chen Songlin of the Deep Sea Academy, both of them were generals. The real leader of the East Emperor Palace was now the marshal who represented Zhongzhou State in Eastern Europe to expand the territory of the motherland. He fought unhindered, and his spirit was amazing. He would rather die than retreat. After the end of the first day of the final maneuver, the young man, who had shocked the dark world, had reached one high point after another. This was not just a rise, but a meteoric rise. If he were here today, Zhuang Huayang and Chen Songlin might not have the chance to speak first. At least Chen Songlin would be behind Li Tianlan. The representative of East Emperor Palace was Wang Yuetong. In the uproar, no one had recovered from Wang Yuetong's identity. The former little princess of the Wang family of Beihai had already announced the future direction of the East Emperor Palace. Tiannan City. It was not until this moment that the entire Zhongzhou state discovered the true situation in Tiannan. The border control corps fell into the hands of the Wang family of Beihai, but the more than 100,000 troops of the Blood Battalion close to Tiannan were still in the hands of the Dongqing clan. Ning Ziyuan, who supported the Li family and was eventually transferred from the Eastern Theater of Operations, was now the commander of the Tiannan Freedom Corps. As for the Southwest Special Warfare Headquarters, Shu Mountain was the banker. Dongqing Rushili Beitian Ning Qiancheng. The 3 members of East Emperor Palace had been completely connected with Tiannan. After returning from Eastern Europe, Li Tianlan stood in Tiannan, and the support behind him was endless. What did this mean? After leaving a deep mark in Eastern Europe, the young marshal of the Li family had obviously made up his mind to leave his footprint in Tiannan. It was not Jiangxia, the sphere of influence of the Li family. It was not Liaodong, the territory of Sai City. It was not Zhongyuan, the base camp of the Dongqing clan. It was Tiannan, the land of more than 40,000 square kilometers, which had no clear ownership, was a bit backward. A land of rivers and mountains was picturesque. Wang Yuetong walked into the spectator stand of the students and shook hands with hundreds of students who had confirmed to join East Emperor Palace. They would leave Huading soon and go to Tiannan. That was Li Tianlan's choice. He had chosen an incomparably broad stage, filled with carnage, deceit, intrigue, and slaughter. However, in the darkness that was mixed with blood, there was the brightest future and prospects for everyone. On this day, only Wang Yuetong came to the stage from East Emperor Palace, but hundreds of people stood at the same time. They were the most elite of the young generation in the past 3 years. They followed East Emperor Palace and went far away. Everyone was looking at this scene, and everyone saw a different meaning in this scene. Complicated emotions spread on the training ground of Sky Academy. Most people thought of Eastern Europe. On this day in Eastern Europe, the old era had just passed. On the same day in Zhongzhou State, a new era had begun. From beginning to end, Gu Xingyun, the so-called god of war in Zhongzhou State, had never appeared on the scene. Snow Country. In the Grand Palace, the president of Snow Country, who was born in the Violet family, received a man who was as strong as a giant with surprise. The man was tall, and his gray clothes looked a little dirty. His face was covered with countless tiny scars, and he looked extremely embarrassed. But he stood in the palace with his own momentum. Inside and outside the palace, all the palace warriors knelt on one knee. He had always been strong internationally. This chapter is not over. Please turn the page. The president of Snow Country, who was even a little overbearing, strode over and gave the giant a big hug. Welcome back. The tone of the president of Snow Country, Jia, was sincere and emotional. This is my world. As long as I don't die, I will come back no matter what. The voice of the giant man was steady and thick. The president laughed heartily. For a moment, the compromise and concession that he had thought about before completely disappeared in his heart and turned into passion and heroism. He was the leader of this fighting nation, so of course he should have a stronger desire to fight than anyone else. He looked at the giant in front of him and said in a deep voice, "What do you want?" "I want to get my things back." The giant's tone was flat. President Jia hesitated for a moment, and then said decisively, "Of course it belongs to you." "I also want the polar bear." The giant's voice became deeper and deeper. "I need his strength." In the hearts of countless people in the dark world, the polar bear of Snow Country was not a big animal that lived in the polar region, and was extremely ferocious, but looked a little cute after being tamed. Instead, it was a cutting-edge force that was always protected by Snow Country, and rarely used. That was the most elite force of the entire military of Snow Country. The military of Zhongzhou State had the most elite and most terrifying Thunderbolt Battalion. But under the Thunderbolt, there were also the Bloody Massacre, Black Dragon, Pegasus, and Polar Bear. In a sense, was the trump card of Snow Country. This was a force that could dominate the world. However, very few people knew that the so-called Polar Bear unit was actually two units. The former was the Arctic. The latter was the Bear. What the giant wanted was the Arctic Army and the Bear Army. President Jia took a deep look at him and said without hesitation, "Yes." The giant nodded and said, "Thank you." "No problem." President Jia voice was serious and cold. "At this time, I can give you whatever you want. But the question is, what can you give me?" "Order." The giant's tone was calm. "I can give you order. An order that only belongs to our own people. Snow Country only belongs to the people of Snow Country." His voice covered the whole palace. All the palace warriors were shocked at the same time. The giant turned around and looked at the orderly figures of the warriors in the palace. He said calmly, "Who dares to fight with me?" There was a slight silence in the grand palace for a moment. In the next second, a furious, earth-shattering roar suddenly rang out, shaking the skies. "Fight!" Jia expression became more and more serious. His eyes gradually became bloodshot. "Can I trust you?" Compared to others. The giant looked into his eyes and did not give in at all. "I am more trustworthy than them." Jia nodded and reached out his hand. "Your Highness, please." The giant walked into the palace hall. From this moment on, the accurate and conclusive news, centered on the palace of Snow Country, spread directly throughout the whole country, and then rushed out of Eastern Europe and continued to stir around the world. This was the official channel of the whole Snow Country, or rather the ultimatum. On the night of August 24th in Eastern Europe, President Jia of Snow Country personally signed the battle leader. The Arctic Army. All the elites of the Bear Army. President Jia, in the name of Snow Country, officially declared war on all the dark forces staying in Eastern Europe. Snow Country asked all forces to withdraw from Eastern Europe within 3 days. Otherwise, there would be a real war. The Polar Bear Army, which had been silent for a long time, reappeared in front of the world. And these two forces, which dominated the world, now had a new leader, Fregalus, the chief marshal of Snow Country's military headquarters. Many people in the dark world had never heard of this name, but probably no one would be unfamiliar with his code name in the dark world. The leader of the Polar Ground Alliance, Tyrant. Late at night that day, Tyrant, who had been missing for a long time, reappeared in the palace of Snow Country. He took the leader of the president and rolled up the vanguard in the capital of Snow Country. He went straight to Mormons. The headquarters of the Polar Ground Alliance was there. The news was passed on quickly. On this night that was destined to be unusual, many things were brewing quickly and finally taking shape. The whole of Eastern Europe began to take action in the chaos like never before. All the countries, all the high-level officials, all the wealthy families. Everyone was moving. Different positions, different demands, and different expectations directly erupted into a huge collision after a short period of brewing. The aftermath of the collision began to spread throughout Eastern Europe. President Jia Delin of Snow Country had convened several heads of state for a conference call. In Reki City, many patriarchs of wealthy families were nervously waiting for Li Tianlan's final reply. The grand banquet had begun. The agreement that had just been signed was sent back to Yuzhou as soon as possible under the cover of the army. The plane passed through the clouds. Under the clear sky, Wang Shengxiao, who was holding the sword box, became more and more calm and indifferent. In the hotel in Reki City, Li Huaqing received a call and directly threw the cup in his hand in anger. In the hospital, Situd Songyue was restless. In the ward next door, Qin Dongqiao was talking with his younger brother Qin Shilai about the past. Raphael, the leader of the Dark Knights, was still in a coma, but he gradually showed signs of waking up. This chapter is not over. Please turn the page. Li Shi walked through the streets and alleys of Im and continued to move forward. The bus ran in the dark, and Mormons was getting closer and closer. Wang Tianzong began to practice calligraphy again. The vehicle cut through the wind and rain in the dark. Tribulation held the steering wheel tightly. The engine was roaring wildly, and his eyes were completely dead. There was silence in the square. Tens of thousands of elites of the Snowdance Corps were imprisoned in the square like statues. The elites of the Purgatory of Heaven capital began to gather toward the castle where deity was. In the church, Arcis, the Saint War Angel of the Vatican, looked at Holy Virgin Angel, who was tied to the cross and covered in blood, and was roaring hysterically. Angel's face was numb. Several burly saint warriors pounced on her with a grim smile and tore apart her long dress. Angel, who had been disheartened for a long time, began to struggle desperately. With a scream, a thick steel needle directly pierced her delicate wrist and nailed her arm to the cross. The white dress was torn to pieces and kept flying. All the beauty began to be torn apart in the final madness, broken, and finally desperate. Lin Fonting redetermined the movements of some of the elites of the Lin clan in the manor. In the manor with birds singing and flowers fragrant, the dense fog had begun to rise uncontrollably. The door of the hall of the castle was closed. Deity, dressed in a wide robe, took off his shoes, stood on the ground, and began to meditate. In Linen City, Li Honghe stood on the mountain, looking in the direction of Eastern Europe, and was muttering to himself. At the junction of Snow Country and Im, Jiang Shangyu, who had disappeared, was holding a bottle of wine, looking out of the window at the wind and rain, and smiling carefreely. At the airport of Huading, Wang Yuetong had already boarded the plane with the members of the East Emperor Palace. All over the world. Beautiful, cruel, urgent, cold, proud, and desperate. This era, the next era, the young and the older generation. Everyone and everything began to converge crazily. Outside Reki City, in the continuous rain, a black vehicle drove over. The master of Samsara Palace put on a black mask and a black cloak. Flaming Fire stood beside the master of Samsara Palace and looked at Li Tianlan. Her eyes trembled violently. Qin Weibai took Li Tianlan's hand and said softly, "I'm leaving. Remember what you promised me. You will take me to Tiannan." Li Tianlan nodded with a smile and touched her hair. He looked at the master of Samsara Palace and said solemnly, "Stay alive." The master of Samsara Palace did not speak, just looked at him quietly. Her eyes were deep and calm, so deep that they seemed to be able to accommodate all emotions. "From now on," she spoke slowly, her voice difficult and hoarse. But as she spoke, her voice became smooth, steady, and a little cold. "Be careful." Li Tianlan did not answer but repeated again, "Stay alive." The master of Samsara Palace waved her hand, turned around, and walked into the black car. Qin Weibai put her arms around Li Tianlan's neck and kissed him. Then she got into the car. Flaming Fire stood by the car and looked at Li Tianlan for a long time before she slowly turned around. The black car started. The wind and rain scattered between heaven and earth. The car lights were getting farther and farther away, and finally became extremely faint. Li Tianlan watched quietly, and for a moment he seemed to be at a loss. In the moving car, Flaming Fire looked at the master of Samsara Palace through the rearview mirror with a complicated look in her eyes. In the wind and rain that they had been walking for a long time, the master of Samsara Palace suddenly said, "Stop the car." There was a flash of light in Flaming Fire's eyes, and she stepped on the brake immediately. The master of Samsara Palace opened the door and looked at the road. The world was filled with wind, rain, and darkness. The road was far away. Vaguely in a trance, there seemed to be a person standing in the wind and rain, motionless. The master of Samsara Palace took a step forward subconsciously. Her foot fell, and she finally froze on the spot. At this moment in the night he stood far away from her, and she stood far away from him. The distance was not very far. Separated by darkness and wind and rain, it was as far as a natural moat. The master of Samsara Palace stood there, looking at the night deeply. She still had a lot to say, but she couldn't say a word. Under the night, the two people stood far away from each other, looking at each other. Like joy, like sadness. Like thinking, like forgetting. At this moment, no one knew what she was thinking. Time seemed to have passed in a moment, but also like thousands of years. The master of Samsara Palace moved her body, turned around, and walked back into the car. "Let's go," she said slowly and closed her eyes. There seemed to be liquid sliding down her face, and it was extremely cold through the metal mask. Flaming Fire drove without saying a word. But at some point, she bit her lip hard, and her eyes were red from crying. "This fool," she cursed with a sobbing voice. The master of Samsara Palace smiled, and she seemed to be a little tired. She reached out and held Qin Weibai's palm, saying softly, "Everything in the world is the hardest to be yourself." Qin Weibai bit her lip and nodded, and her eyes were slightly red. The master of Samsara Palace looked ahead and didn't look back. Mormons was thousands of miles away from her sight. That was the end of everything. Her end. The wind and rain were howling. She leaned against the seat, and with an unparalleled weight, she was getting closer and closer to the end. It was coming to an end. There must be an end. End of this chapter. Bookmark for easier reading. That you're tuning in to the Echoes of the Heart YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.